Welcome. As people are making their way to be seated, there are roped off, the back half of the sanctuary is roped off, and so please come forward. And we want to welcome you all to our first ever Relevant Conference. The mission of the conference is to equip the people of God for life in a modern world. In addition to that as well, to give an answer for the hope of the Christian faith to those who are skeptical, those who have questions, those who have doubts. We want to welcome you all here to Faith Presbyterian Church. I know many of you, if not all of you, are from different areas of Southern California, different colleges, different universities, different churches, and maybe even just from the community you heard from through social media. So we want to welcome you all, and we hope that this will be an informative time, a time to ask questions, a time to consider the truth of Christianity as it relates to science. And so we're really excited about this morning's speakers. But before I get into our first talk, I just wanted to give you just some introductory remarks regarding why we started the Relevant Conference. When I was a medical researcher and a graduate student in 1998, probably before that, but I always had questions about the truth and the validity of the Christian faith as it relates to science, that I always thought of science as undermining or maybe pushing me towards questioning the truth of Christianity and the truth of Scripture and the Bible and the claims of Christ and of God. And in 1998, there were the Noble Lectures on the campus of Harvard University, and they were 3-day lectures on the question of God by the head of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Mass General Hospital. And he gave talks on the worldview of Sigmund Freud and contrasted it with C.S. Lewis, and they were the most fascinating talks on Christianity, Jesus, science, and faith. And after each talk were responses by world-renowned, internationally known and recognized scientists, 2 of which were C. Everett Koop, who was the Surgeon General prior to that, and he gave a response, and he made a case for the reasonableness of Christianity and the necessity of the gospel for Christianity as well as science. And then I also heard from Dr. Francis Collins, who was head of the Genome Project, Human Genome Project at the time, who was also a strong evangelical believer. And to see 2 scientists, 2 professionals at the upper echelon of their professions to hold the gospel and the Christian faith along with a strong understanding of science and of medicine, it really just changed my life. And I thought to myself, I wish that I had something like that for myself earlier in college when I was going through those doubts. And that's what Relevant was born from, that it is an opportunity to give resources to undergraduates and those in graduate school, maybe young professionals in the sciences, or maybe you're science-minded in one way, or you have questions about Christianity with regards to science, that we wanted to offer these talks and an open Q&A forum for you to ask those questions and for us to give you the best answers that Christianity offers. So let me just introduce our first talk. I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Stefan Sinchea, PhD, SMB. He is a developmental biologist, clinical geneticist. He is currently a research fellow for the National Cancer Institute of the NIH. Center for Complex Biological Systems, the National Science Foundation's Center for Multiscale Cell Fate. I love these long titles. And the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Strokes, Center for Stem Cell Translational Medicine for Neurological Disorders. He will be moving this summer to Texas to start a lab at Baylor University with NIH. So we're really, really glad that he is continuing to develop his scientific and professional career. But he is also a wonderful Christian believer, a member of our church, and we are very sad to see him go, but we're glad to be able to hear him in this forum before. So without further ado, Dr. Stephen Sinchea.
Thank you, James, for having me here today. James came to me about starting this conference more than a year ago. And over the course of the year, I've been trying to put this talk together, and I have to say I've been kind of embarrassed, because it was one of the most difficult talks I have had to put together. And I give talks many times a year in many different places of the world. And it's interesting to me because I thought this would be an easy talk for me to give. Because out of all the things that I like to talk about most, yes, I'm a scientist, but I like to talk most about Jesus. And that's who I want to talk to you about today. But I'm not going to be doing all of the talking today. You're going to be doing some of the talking too. And you're going to be doing some of that talking with the people right next to you. And so I want you to get into groups of 4 or so, just with the people right next to you. And I want you to play a game. Right? You're going to introduce yourselves, and this game that you're going to play is usually called 2 truths and 1 lie. But for the sake of time, I want you to just tell 1 truth and 1 lie, and you get permission for the first time to tell a lie sitting in a church. Right? So 1 person at a time, get into groups, people right next to you, and afterward, as a group, I want you to determine which one was the truth and which one was the lie. And the goal is to be good at lying, right? The goal is to tell a lie that comes off like it could be true, but it's not. And then at the end, tell your group which one was the truth and which one was the lie. Now here's the catch. You have 2 minutes, so it needs to go fast. Okay? Ready, set, and go.
This is hard when you know everybody.
Okay, time's up. Let's wrap it up. Time's up. Let's wrap it up. Time's up. So I want you to raise your hand if your group could not figure out the lie that you told. Raise your hand if the group could not figure out the lie you. Are all of you all bad liars? Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up for me if your group could not figure out the lie that you told. Didn't have enough time? Now, in your same group, I want you to think back to the COVID-19 pandemic. You remember that pandemic? With your same group, I want you to share with your group any phrases you remember hearing during the pandemic. Right? So again, go ahead. I'll give you 1 minute to do that, and then we'll talk about it together. Okay, I need a volunteer. I need a volunteer. Some nice person to volunteer. Can you raise your hand? You want to volunteer?
Yeah, that'd be nice.
Hey, can you tell me your name?
Don Pexa,
Don, where are you coming from today?
from Brea.
From Brea. So what phrases do you remember hearing during the COVID-19
Our
pandemic?
friend Young, she came up with lockdown,
Lockdown,
and then essential businesses.
Essential
what is
businesses.
essential? And what else?
Masking.
Oh, masking.
Masking.
Yeah. Social distancing.
Anybody else in a different group? You remember hearing any other phrases? This young man over here.
Young man, thank you.
Tell me your name.
My name is Michael,
Michael
and I came from Modesto. If you
Modesto. Thanks for
But,
coming.
Trust the science.
Trust the science. Trust the science. Any other phrases anybody remembers hearing? Vaccinate. And you're Randy, right? We met earlier?
Yes.
Where are you coming from today, Randy?
Long Beach.
Thanks for coming. What do you remember hearing during the
2
COVID?
weeks to slow the spread.
2 weeks to slow the spread?
Came from bats in a wet market.
Came from bats in a wet market. Okay. We heard all sorts of phrases during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to talk about one of those phrases, one of them that you actually shared, that you heard among the groups this morning. And that was this phrase, trust the science. This was an interesting phrase because before the pandemic, I had never heard of it before. And I was a practicing scientist. During the pandemic, I started to hear it. I heard it everywhere. I heard it on the news. I heard it on talk radio. I heard it while talking to people over dinner. I don't know where this phrase came from. It probably came from a different phrase that came before the pandemic, and that phrase was trust the process. And maybe it somehow morphed into this phrase. Trust the science. Now, I'm not here to tell you today whether you should or should not trust the science. And I'm not here to tell you that because I actually think we already do trust the science. And the reason why I say that is because if there's one lesson I learned during the COVID-19 pandemic, was that we already trust the science. And we trusted the science enough to give scientists authority in our lives. How do I know this? Because when scientists pranced in front of the TV, and you rarely ever see scientists in front of the TV, and public health officials told you there was an illness ravaging the other side of the world and there were people dying, you believed them. Even though you've never been to the other side of the world. You never counted the bodies. And when they told you that we need to lock down in order to slow the spread, we did. And when they told you to stay 6 feet apart at the grocery store, we did. And when public health officials told us to mask in order to stop the spread, we did. And they told us not to engage in large gatherings at homes, we didn't do that. And when immunologists came out to tell us to vaccinate, to save the lives of your grandparents and other people you knew, we did. Now, there were some of us that maybe did not. There were some of us that were skeptical. But for the most part, the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of us, we trusted the science. Maybe a better way of saying is we wanted to trust the science. We already trust the science. We already give scientists authority in our lives. The question is why? Why do we do that? Why have we done that? And so in the first part of my talk today, that is the question I want us to talk about. Why do we give scientists authority in our lives? And in order to facilitate that discussion, I want to also talk about the history and development of gene theory. Okay, that sounds weird, right? How is that related to giving scientists authority? Well, stick around and you'll find out. In the second part of my talk, I want to give some reasons why we should be cautious about giving scientists authority. And by that, I don't mean not giving them any authority, but we need to be cautious about giving them maybe an authority that is too high, a level of authority that's too much for them to have. And in order to talk about that, I have to show you how science is actually done. How do scientists actually do and practice modern science today? And in the last part of my talk, I want to make the case for why I think Jesus is deserving of ultimate authority. And the case that I'm going to make with you this morning may not be the case that you think I'm going to make. You might end up being surprised about what I have to say to you about that. First, the history and development of gene theory. Does it feel like you're back in college, sitting in lecture, and you're wondering if this is a 50-minute lecture or a 2-hour lecture? The history and development of gene theory. In 1822, a boy was born to a poor family, born to a peasant farmer, and he was born in the place called Silesia, a part of the Austrian Empire at that time. Today, that area spans a part of the Czech Republic as well as a part of Poland. And although he was poor, he did manage to go to university, which was almost unheard of at the time. He went to a university in the Czech Republic called the University of Olomouc, one of the oldest universities and prestigious universities of the Czech Republic. still a prestigious university today. But because he was poor, he couldn't finish. He had to drop out. His parents could not afford to continue his education. This was during his late teens. It wasn't until a few years later, in his early 20s, in order to continue his education, he decides to join a monastery. And this monastery was called St. Thomas's Abbey, also in the Czech Republic, at a place called Brno. He spends a number of years there, and he trains and becomes a priest. After he finishes, St. Thomas's Abbey decides to fund his education, and they send him off to the University of Vienna. And there at this university, he studies the sciences under two individuals. The first person that he studied science from was a physicist and a mathematician. His name was Christian Doppler. And if that name sounds familiar to you, that's because his last name describes that sound that you hear when a fire truck or a police car passes by you really fast. It's called the Doppler effect. That's the man who this young man studied under. And the other individual he studied under at the University of Vienna was a well-known plant physiologist named Franz Unger. Some of you might already know who I might be talking about. Maybe you're reliving your traumatic experiences from your biology course. His name was Gregor Mendel, a priest, and one of the most respected fathers of genetic science today. After his studies at the University of Vienna, he returns to Brno, to St. Thomas's Abbey. And he takes what he learns at that university and he applies it to some plants in the gardens of that abbey. And it is there in the gardens of this abbey that Mendel does something revolutionary. What did he do? Well, he takes these pea plants, and one of the pea plants has flowers that are pink, and another pea plant has flowers that are white. But there's something unique about these pea plants. They're pure breeding. What does that mean? It means that whenever he took the pollen of the pink flower and pollinated itself, it always produced another pink flower. Nothing ever changed. It's a pink flower through and through. And the same is true for the white flower. When he takes the pollen from the pea plant that has white flowers and he self-pollinates it, it produces a white flower. Always, every generation. It is a white flower through and through. One day he decides to cross-pollinate. Take the pollen from the pink flower and pollinate the white flower, and vice versa, reciprocally, to take the pollen from the white flower and pollinate the pink flower, and then see what happens. And this is what happens. All of the progeny have white flowers. He calls this the F1 progeny, or the F1 generation. So he's a thinking scientist. He's applying what he has learned at the University of Vienna, and he goes, what can I conclude about what I have just observed, about what I have just seen? Well, he says, there's something about pink, about the nature of pink, that pink color. It dominates, it overshadows that white color, and so he says, pink dominates white. And you might have heard that term about dominant and recessive alleles. So he goes on. He says, what if I take these flowers, not these, what if I cross-pollinate among these flowers, just the flowers among the F1 generation? What is going to happen then? And so that's what he does. He cross-pollinates just the flowers from that F1 generation. But this time, when he observes and looks at the progeny, he finds that 3/4 of the time the flowers are pink, and 1/4 of the time the flowers are white. So again, he looks at the data, he looks at the results, and he asks himself, what can I conclude? What can I say about the nature of white? Well, he says, well, if white reappears, the only way that you can have a white flower is if there is some factor that carries the information for white, and it must have been among its parents, even though we could not see it. Although those flowers were pink, they had the factor for white. So although the plants don't appear white, maybe they're masking the factor for white. That the nature of pink masks, overshadows whatever it is that is the nature of white. He goes on further. He goes, well, if that is the case, then flowers or pea plants with white flowers must have at least one factor, some unit that carries it for white color. And it cannot have any factors for pink color, because if pink was in it, it would be pink. The only way that it can be white is if it doesn't have any information for pink at all. And so he labels it with the letter W for white. This flower must have the information for white. And then pink plants must have at least one factor denoting pink. So he labels it with the letter P for pink. But if this flower is white, the information for white must have come from these flowers. So those flowers in the F1 generation must also have at least one factor for white. Well, Mendel submits his work. He does a lot more than just this. For the sake of time, and you don't doze off, I kept it short. That was already too technical, right? That was too much. Too much at 9 o'clock in the morning. He publishes his work in 1865 under the title Versuche über Pflanzen hybriden. How's my German? It's okay? Experiments on plant hybridization, and nobody cares. Nobody cares. He dies with nobody caring in 1884. But then his work is rediscovered. In 1900, 3 other botanists and plant biologists rediscover his work. And they publish similar findings to him. In 1902, a man named by Walter Sutton, he coins for the first time the word gene. And he ascribes what Mendel calls factors as genes. In 1909, Wilhelm Johansen coins the word gene. Walter Sutton hypothesized that these factors are carried on by chromosomes. And in 1909, William coins the word gene for what Mendel was talking about. And in 1910, Thomas Hunt Morgan discovers the first gene in a fly chromosome. My boy Mendel, impressive individual. Just from breeding plants, looking at their color, counting their progeny, and using the statistics he learned from Christian Doppler, he concludes something like a factor, something like a gene must exist that carries information to explain what we look like and what we are. Impressive. And the reason why I go through all of this is to give you one of the reasons why I think we give scientists authority in our lives. And that is because we hear stories like this. We hear stories and moments in history where scientists seem to get it right. And they get it right with so little, way, way before their time. We're impressed by it. Because we knew and we know if we were in the gardens of that abbey, we wouldn't be mating or pollinating anything. But there are some other reasons why we give scientists authority. But I want you to tell me those reasons. So get back in with your groups, and I want you to talk about some other reasons why we give scientists authority in our lives. Because it's not just the one that I gave you. So I'll give you 2 minutes to do that. So let's wrap it up. Let's talk about this together. What are some other reasons why we give scientists authority in our lives? Anybody want to share?
Because the results substantiated.
Can you say that again, John?
The results substantiated. When I drop a pencil, it goes down.
It's repeatable.
Repeatable.
It's consistent.
Consistent.
The findings. What else? Wait for the mic. Wait for the mic. Thank you, Larry.
You're dealing with probability in science, but often things that they have said or predicted have come true. And people will tend to believe it even when they may be quite wrong on things. But in science, you're dealing with probability.
Mm-hmm. What else?
That we've been told that they know it all.
Or sometimes when you're at dinner with a scientist, you really wonder if they believe it about themselves. Skip.
God created order in his universe, and science discovers that and unpacks it by God's grace and providence.
I see another hand over there. Wait for me, wait for me. All right, young man.
Scientists get to see things that we usually don't.
Scientists get to study things we don't usually get to study.
I think that sometimes it has to do with money, power, and position, and that some people we're also a bit lazy to double check them.
They have position. Scientists have respect and status, right?
For me, it's there's so much of our modern life is contingent and grounded in the science. Our phones, our cars, the internal combustion engine, medications, our clothes, our shoes, the glasses we wear, surgeries, whenever we go, we trust our doctors.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of reasons why one more, last one.
So we believe because scientists would just study on things that they're interested in, and they focus on that. And as people, most of the people doesn't have time to read, study, and we don't have the knowledge to do that. And so when they put their time to do that, so of course, we believe them, and otherwise, we all be killed if we don't.
So necessity. We just don't have the time to study the things they study, and so we kind of have to default to giving them authority in our lives. Those are all great answers, and I think they're all true because they're your reasons about why you give scientists authority in your lives. But we ought to be cautious about the level of authority that we give to scientists. I'm not saying that scientists shouldn't be given any authority in our lives, that they can't speak at all to us. But we ought to be cautious. In order to help you understand that, we need to talk about how modern science is actually done. And that is because even the story that I told you about Gregor Mendel, he did not really practice modern science. He practiced a premature, primitive form of the sciences that we know today. He practiced a form of reasoning called inductive reasoning, a form of reasoning that was advanced by the scientific revolution in the 1600s, particularly by Francis Bacon. Before then, a different kind of reasoning was often used, right, called deductive reasoning. So how is modern science actually done? How do modern scientists practice science today? And if you were to go online and look, you would find something called the scientific method. And I hate those diagrams because they're oversimplified. They don't really give you the real truth of how scientists in academic settings actually practice science. So I'm going to give you the real thing, okay? You like real? Science actually begins with knowledge. Now, you might have been taught that science begins with observation. You look at something, and then you begin to do it. You observe a problem, per se. But science has to begin with knowledge because the scientific method cannot be performed unless there is prior knowledge. Knowledge is a precondition for the application and practice of the scientific method. The scientific method cannot acquire first knowledge. It begins with knowledge. So let's give an example. Let's say you have a green thumb, and we're sticking with plants because Gregor Mendel did plants, so we're sticking with the plant analogies here. And you have some plants by a window, and you have some plants in the corner of your room, and you wonder, you notice that the plants in the dark corner of the room are a little shorter, don't seem to grow as well, and the plants by the window seem to do really well. So you formulate a question. Your question could be, does Maybe light has something to do with it. Does light affect how well my plants grow? After a question is formed, you need to form a hypothesis. Now, what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is not a prediction. It is not a prediction about what you think your results might be. It is a little more nuanced than that. A hypothesis is an explanation. It is a statement that attempts to define or explain a relationship between a cause and an effect. Okay? Let me give you an example in our analogy here. What is our effect? The growth of plants. What is the cause? Presumably light. What is the relationship? The relationship here in this hypothesis is that light enhances, it contributes to the growth of a plant. More light, more growth. Less light, less growth. Now, this is an example of what is called a correlative relationship. Something goes up, cause goes up, effect goes up. Cause goes down, effect goes down. Or cause goes up, effect goes down. Right? But there is another kind of explanatory relationship. It is not just correlative between a cause and effect, and that is mechanistic. Right? You can also make a mechanistic hypothesis, meaning that the way that the light increases the growth of a plant is by electrons being cast from the light and the plant's processing those electrons, so forth and so forth. That is a mechanistic kind of hypothesis. Now that you have a hypothesis, you have something that can be tested. Right? And so you can form an experiment. What does an experiment attempt to do? It attempts to measure the effect under changes to the cause. Right? You have to change the cause and then measure the outcome, the effect in question. So in our example here, and good experiments control for other possible causes. It doesn't attempt to ignore that there might be other causes in the way. So one experiment in our case would be that you measure the height of plants grown in the dark versus those grown in the light. What is your effect? It's the growth of the plants. What is the cause? It's the light. What is the change? The absence or the presence of the light. Right? Measuring an effect under changes to a cause. Well, if you were to do that, then you would get data. You would get measurements, different heights for all of the plants. Plants in the dark versus plants in the light. So you have to analyze that data in some way. So in this case, we have some data. Please don't fall asleep on me. Let's say you measured 4 plants, 4 in the dark, 4 in the light. You have to make sense of that data somehow. So one of the ways you can make sense of the data is just by looking at it. That's the most primitive form of data analysis. And you can kind of tell which one's taller, the ones in the light or the ones in the dark. The ones in the light. Then you can make a conclusion regarding your experiment. My plants grow taller in the light than when they were in the dark. Now, after you begin with knowledge, a question, a hypothesis, an experiment, data analysis, and conclusions, you need to ask how your conclusion relates to your hypothesis. Remember what our hypothesis was? That light enhances the growth of plants. And so, in regards to the conclusion and the data we acquired, does the data and the conclusion support the hypothesis? In this case, yes. It's nice and clean. Usually it's not. Usually it's not. Now here's what also happens. Something called peer review. Now you might have done it yourself. You might have done the hypothesis, the experiment, the data analysis, the conclusions, but you could be wrong about all of them. You could have made the wrong hypothesis. performed the wrong experiment, did not look at the data right, and even drew the wrong conclusion. So you need someone else to look at it. This is called peer review. So a scientist takes the results, and there are two forms of peer review, either informal, before publication, you meet with other scientists at a conference or in a lab meeting, and it is formal. You publish the results and other people read them. And in peer review, other scientists who are familiar with your work might tell you a number of things in regards to what you just did. So in regards to experimentation, they might tell you that you performed the wrong experiment completely. Whatever you did was not actually testing the hypothesis you had. Or you didn't control for other causes. Yes, you put your plants by the window because that's where the light was, but how do you know that it's not the window that makes plants grow? You have to test for other possible causes. And then there's data analysis. They might say something about the way you analyze the data. Maybe you don't have enough replicates. Or you didn't use the right statistical test. That happens quite often. Your conclusions. Maybe you should have arrived at a different conclusion altogether. You're just not thinking right about it. And in regards to your hypothesis, maybe the data do not actually support your hypothesis at all. You think it does, but it doesn't. That's peer review. And then after this cycle repeats itself, you'll get to a point where generally people agree. Finally, you get to the point where, okay, experiment's good, data analysis is good, conclusions is good, other experts in your field agree, and then there's replication. Can other people redo the same things you just did? And can they get the same results and the same conclusions? So they repeat your experiment. And after this cycle repeats itself, whatever those conclusions are reaches a point where it becomes accepted as knowledge. Now, a scientist doesn't say that. But functionally, if you act and behave like it is knowledge, then that's what you believe it is, even though you may not say that. That's how the scientific method works. But there are some limitations and pitfalls to the scientific method. What are some of those? And there are limitations and pitfalls at every part of the method. Let's talk about knowledge. One of the pitfalls is mistaking widely held beliefs as knowledge. You hear everybody say it. Everybody tells you don't give a chocolate to dogs because dogs die from eating chocolate, but you've never actually tested it. You don't really know it. Don't test it on your dog. But that's what I mean. It's a widely held belief, and it's so widely held that we dare not question it as knowledge. We hear it repeated to us over and over again, so we assume it's got to be true. Everybody else believes it. Now, among scientists are prone to this too, and that is mistaking published conclusions as knowledge. Simply writing that it was published and acting like it's knowledge. How about the level of question? One of the pitfalls is failing to question widely accepted dogma, meaning failing to ask the question at all because you assumed it doesn't need to be asked. Hypothesis. Now, before I tell you the pitfall, I want you to learn it for yourself. Ready? Look at this image. See, it's a room with things of different colors. I want you to count as many red items as you can in the room. Okay? Go. I'll give you like 5 seconds. Now tell me, how many white items were in the room? What's the problem? There were a lot of white items. How come you can't tell me? Because you were not looking for it. And so what happens is when you make a hypothesis, when you try to provide an explanatory statement between a cause and effect, you end up tending to find the very thing you look for. And you miss the things you don't look for, even though they were there in plain sight. Experimentation. One of the limitations of the scientific method is that not everything is experimentable. If you want to test whether you have a good marriage, good luck. The scientific method cannot help you do that. But just because it cannot help you do that doesn't mean that you don't have a good marriage. It just means that the method cannot help you acquire the truth about your marriage. You see that? Another pitfall is failure to control for other possible causes. Or your samples don't represent the general population. Let me just tell you a story. A number of years ago, there was a study about a drug that claimed to prevent prostate cancer. And they showed that group 2 did not have prostate cancer and group 1 did. And this was a famous study. And then one day, another person looked at the study and found out that the group that did not develop prostate cancer as a result of taking that drug didn't have prostates because they were women in that group. So scientists can fall under that as well. Or using tools that do not give reliable measurements, not understanding that tools have variance, a level of accuracy and precision. Then there's data analysis. And I want to give you another exercise to help you understand a limitation of data analysis. One of those that I see many scientists do is not defining ahead of time how many samples are needed. So you just do what you can afford based off of the funding you have. Maybe it's 5 replicates and 10, and then you draw your conclusions from it. But you never actually, ahead of time, determine how many you actually needed. Or excluding outliers from the data simply because they were far. Or using the wrong statistical test. Look at these 2 tables. I want you to tell me which table is skinnier. Right? Just offer your first-hand impression, which table is skinnier? It's this one, right? That's what it looks like. When in fact, it's the same size as the table next to it. What's the point? It's that depending on how you look at the table, the vantage point, the point of view, you could be looking at the same table and draw a difference. See a difference when there is not one. And this happens all the time. Seeing differences when there are no differences. Another pitfall is most biologists misinterpret what is actually meant by p-values. And they also have a poor grasp of statistics. I know I'm running short on time. I'll try to wrap up. Bear with me. Conclusions. Your conclusions don't actually follow the data. Making the wrong conclusion. Ignoring other possible explanations. Or drawing conclusions that are too broad. I see that all the time. Because they want to make their work sound more important or more impactful than it really is. And so even though you only study just a cell line, you want to say, it can cure all cancers now. Right? But it doesn't. Peer review. It works really well when reviewers do not have a vested interest in the same field of research. Other scientists are likely to agree with you if they share the same point of view. And scientists with pedigrees, with nice letters after the name, institutions, their mentors are famous, they tend to be looked upon favorably. And the same work that could have been done by some nobody at a nobody institution doesn't get recognized. Happens all the time. Replication. This is probably the most important problem in the sciences today. and that is that scientists rarely ever repeat the experiments published by other scientists. Almost never. Mainly because they don't have the time, don't have the money, and the vast majority of experiments are not repeatable. The vast majority. About 70%. Some things to think about. And these are things that even scientists themselves fall into. Lastly, I want to make the case for why I think Jesus is deserving of ultimate authority in our lives. And the case that I want to make to you this morning is not because he's God. It's a different reason altogether. In order to help you understand that, I want to read to you a passage of Scripture from one of Jesus' own disciples, disciple John. And you might be familiar with this passage of Scripture. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never become thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." Just then his disciples came back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman. But no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking with her?" So the woman left her water jar and went away into town and said to the people, "Come, see a man who told me all that I ever did." God bless to us this reading from God's holy word, for it is the word of the Lord. Amen. It's a familiar story. If you're a Christian, you've heard this moment of Jesus' life before. He's passing through Samaria, making his way to Galilee. And he's tired. He's thirsty. So he stops by at a well. That's where you got water in those days. And while he's there at this well, a woman comes to draw water from it. He tells this woman to draw water for him, to give him a drink, and she is shocked. She's shocked because it was unheard of for someone like Jesus, a Jew, to talk to someone like her, a Samaritan. But then Jesus tells her, if you knew who I was, you would ask me for a drink. You should be more shocked. Not that I talk to you, but who is talking to you. Because what I have is living water. But she doesn't know what he's offering her. She thinks that what he's offering her is still water. So she says to him, living water? Are you greater than Jacob? Jacob dug this well. This well is deep. You don't even have anything to draw the water with. Where am I going to find this living water that you're offering to me? But then Jesus changes the subject. He tells her to go back into town and to fetch her husband and come back. She has to admit, she has no husband. Jesus tells her, you're right. In fact, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you know now is not your husband. Now, this doesn't mean that she was a promiscuous lady. It just means that she's had 5 husbands. Maybe it was a very difficult life for her as a woman in Samaria. Just then, his disciples appear. They come back from town, and they see Jesus talking with this woman, and they're shocked by it too. So shocked that they don't even say anything to him. And they don't say anything to the woman. And the woman decides to take her things and walk back to town. And in that town, she tells them to come meet a man who told her everything she had done. I sometimes wonder if she missed the point. I would have expected for her to go back into town and to tell them to come meet the man who offered her living water. But she did not. But maybe it's because I missed the point. Maybe I was so fixated on the water when I should have been fixated on what this woman was fixated on. She told him to come meet the man who told her everything that she had done, to come meet the man who knew everything about her. Because what is the point of living water if the person who offers it to you doesn't know a lick about you? You offer me living water, you don't know anything about me. Why do you think I need that kind of water? Which leads me to the first reason why I think Jesus is deserving of ultimate authority in our lives, is because Jesus knows the truth about you. Why is that important? Think about it with me for a moment. We give scientists authority in our lives for knowing the truth about all sorts of things in the universe. We give them authority in our lives because they know the truth about the way engines work, or high pressure and low pressure and how airplane wings work, or how cancer works, or how you develop from one single cell into the many cells that you have now. We give scientists authority in our lives for knowing the truth, the realities outside of us. But how much more should we give authority to the one who knows the truth and the reality about us? About us, about you, about me. Here's the problem. Not all truths are created equal. All truths are equally true by the fact that they're true. But not all truths are equal because not all truths equally matter in your life. The truth about the engine, the truth about the airplane wings, the truth about development does not compare to the truth that can be known about you. And you know it. In your heart, you wish someone knew you. You wish someone knew what it was like to be you. Politicians understand this very well. Every election cycle, they want to pretend like they're just like you. So when they travel to the South, all of a sudden they have a Southern drawl. Oh, they talk like me, they speak like me, they must understand what it's like to live in the South like me. Or when they fly over country and make a stop, they eat in a diner, but they never eat in diners. They wouldn't eat in anything less than a Michelin star. And we fall for it. We're suckers. Because we want someone to rule over us who is like us. The desire is so deep, so innate to who we are. See, Jesus knows the truth about you. Yes, he knows the truth about the rest of the universe, but more important than that, he knows the truth about you. And that truth is not accessible to scientists. There's not a scientist in this world who's ever made a publication about you. There's not a scientist who has ever obtained tenure for studying you. There's not a scientist who's ever written an R1 grant to the NIH to get funding to study you. But Jesus has. He is a far better, a far greater scientist because he chose to study you. Not the trees, not the animals, but you. You. He knows the truth about you. When you're about to go to bed at night and you can't sleep and you tell yourself, I just need to smoke one more time. When you wake up in the morning and you find it so hard to get out of bed, you're so deeply depressed, so anxious, you don't know what to do with your life, you can't make it to class, he knows. When you thought that you were going to be a surgeon or a medical doctor and you failed your first chemistry class, he knows. When the first major you chose did not turn out to be the major that you would end up having, he knows. When you got out of college and you spent a whole year looking for a job and you couldn't find one, he knows. He knows. You say, Stephen, I don't know if I want to be known like that. Because if Jesus knows the truth about me, he wouldn't offer me the water he offered that woman. If he knew the secrets that I hid in my heart, if he knew the filth about me, he wouldn't give it to me. I don't want to be known like that because I would have to live in shame for the rest of my life. No, not true. No, not true. How do I know it? Because that woman that day at that well, although she was known, although he knew the things that maybe even she was ashamed of, what did she do? She went back into her town to tell the people, come meet the man who knew me, who knew everything about me. You see, there is a way to be known. A way to be known by Jesus that doesn't result in shame, but results in love and grace. A scientist cannot know you like that. Your doctor does not know you like that. Your doctor might know your prostate better than he knows you. It's true. He doesn't know you. First, unlike scientists who know the truth about everything else, Jesus knows the truth about you. The truth about you is far more worth knowing than the truth about the other things in the universe. Second, Jesus is deserving of greater authority in our lives, of ultimate authority, because Jesus obtained the truth about you in a much better way. It is argued that in the 1600s, the beginnings of the scientific method was born, and we have reaped the benefits of that method. But 1,600 years before inductive reasoning, 1,600 years before the scientific method, a far better, far superior method was born. And that is the method of Jesus. We walked through the scientific method earlier. Did you notice something? Notice the way that scientists acquire truth. Notice the way that we have to draw conclusions. We have to observe things. We have to manipulate things. We have to separate things into one group versus another. We have to measure things. And we can only do it by third-party observation. We can only study your cancer by looking at it. We cannot do it by becoming it. We cannot even do it by pretending to take it for ourselves. There's not a single scientist that has ever studied cancer by giving it to himself in order to understand what it's like to be you. You see, Jesus is greater. Jesus is a superior scientist because Jesus has a better method. And his method does not come by third-party observation. His method does not come by experimentation, where he separates you into one group and you into another group in order to observe you. No, his method is superior because he obtained the truth about you by becoming like you. He became like the very thing he sought to know. There is no better way of knowing than that way. You know why? Because even if Jesus knew everything about you, you know what you would say to him? Do you know what you would say to him? You would say, but you don't know what it's like to be me. You can tell me all you want, I need to do this and don't do that, but you don't know how hard it is. No, he does. He does because he became just like you. He was born like you, maybe even born worse off than you. When you were born, you had hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical equipment around you, physicians next to you, medical professionals ready to tend to your every need, but not him. Born in a trough. He grew up like you. He had to learn like you. He worked like you. He worked with his hands. How many of us sit in front of a computer desk all day? You see, Jesus not only knows the truth about you, he obtained that truth in a greater way. And lastly, Jesus dedicated his life to knowing you. At the end of many scientists' life, memorials are held. Scientists gather from all over the world to recognize them for the work and the commitment that they made to their research, for dedicating their life to some random bacterium in a volcano. Listen, how much greater should we honor the one who spent his entire life, from beginning of his birth to the end of his life at his death, to knowing and studying you. You see, this is the reason why I think Jesus is still relevant today in my life and in the 21st century. Because I was first relevant to Jesus before he ever became relevant to me. This morning, I want to extend to you the same invitation that that woman at the well extended to the people of her town. Come, meet the man who knew everything about me, and you will discover he also knows everything about you. And what a joy it is to finally be known and not be the one who has to do all of the knowing. Thank you.
Well, why don't we just take a few minutes, stretch your legs so that we can give Dr. Jack Van Drunen time to get set up and everything. But yes, a 5-minute break. because we. Okay, well, if you could take your seats. I know that there are other folks making their way. We're really excited. Let me give you, I apologize for not giving you the whole schedule. We have 2 more talks, and we'll have a short 5-minute break after the next one. And then at the end of the 3rd talk, we'll have a combined panel Q&A session. So you'll be able to ask any one of the panel, of the 3 speakers, questions and to answer, and we'll have a nice back and forth discussion about various topics. And that'll be at the end at around 12 to 12:30. And then soon after that, we are really excited to have a catered taco lunch for you. We've invited taco caterers, and so if you got a voucher, because you signed up until April 3rd, April 6th, I'm sorry, then that'd be great. There are, I apologize, the next time the restrooms, the men's restrooms are just right to the left of the sanctuary doors going into the fellowship hall there. The ladies' restrooms are both on the other, just to the left, the hallway to the left of the kitchen, as well as the hallway all the way on the far end of the fellowship hall. And so I really apologize. I should have mentioned that. Well, we are excited to have doctoral candidate Jack Van Drunen. He is a candidate in logic and philosophy of science at the University of California, Irvine. He previously earned his BS in computer science at Irvine, and his work has been published in leading journals in two disciplines, particularly mathematical psychology and the philosophy of science. A member of Westminster OPC in Westminster, California, and so without further ado, Jack Van Drunen.
Where should I put my, I can put it here. All right. Hello, everyone. I was going to ask how many students there are in this room. I suspect the number might actually be surprisingly low looking out here, but show of hands, how many of you are students of some variety? You can, if you're like, student at any point in your career. I'm still a student, I'll raise my hand too. Okay, how many of you are in the sciences or some kind of STEM, looking to go into STEM or have done science? Maybe, so some people who aren't students could raise their hand for this one too if they are scientists or whatever else. Okay, cool, great. Was there another question I was going to ask? I think that'll be good for now. Okay, so the title of the talk is The Gospel for Scientists. I picked that out a little while ago. I don't feel too obligated to stick super closely to that. One of the reasons that it's hard to put together a whole talk entitled The Gospel for Scientists is because, like, the Gospel for Scientists, oh, by the way, there's a handout you should all have gotten, just in case you like having, you'll be able to follow along, right? The Gospel for Scientists is the same as the Gospel for everyone else, right? So there are plenty of ways that you could summarize the Gospel. The way that I thought to do it for this talk is that Jesus Christ forgives sin. It's probably the most important thing. He comforts us in our suffering. He empowers us to live new lives by his Spirit. And he's coming again to make everything new. And the talk is mostly going to be focused on the last two of those things. But the gospel for scientists is the same as the gospel for everyone because scientists are people too, right? Think about Gregor Mendel, we heard about earlier. He had a hard life, right? He's born in poverty. He wasn't even able to finish school. He passed his days over in obscurity and died in obscurity. Some scientists have very different kinds of lives. Some of them are recognized during their own time. I like the movie Oppenheimer because it dramatizes the fact that even when you are a scientist who's recognized in your own time, you face plenty of difficulties nonetheless. And I mean, look at Stephenson himself. I suspect that that's a man who learned obedience through suffering. All of those fancy letters that come after his name, each letter, I know this now a little bit from experience, right? Each letter is another gray hair. It's another sleepless night. And you're laughing, but those tears that he was shedding up here were definitely real, right? So yeah, scientists, they don't have harder lives than everybody else. I'm not saying that, right? All lives are hard, but scientists need the gospel too. And I think it's important to remember that if you're thinking, say, about sharing the gospel with scientists, well, they're just like the rest of us. The gospel appeals not just to the intellect. They might be very smart and intellectual, but they're like everyone else. And they need to hear the gospel as much as the next person. Okay, with that out of the way, I've divided this talk into about 2 segments. The first one is a little bit longer than the second one, so if it seems like it's going long, then don't worry. We'll get through this in a cool 45 minutes. So I've titled the first section Biblical Ethics, and the second one a Baptized Imagination. So let's jump right in. So biblical ethics. What I really mean by this is how scientists should think about the fact that Jesus empowers us to live new lives in service to him in light of the fact that Jesus is coming again to make all things new. And this is important for, scientists who are thinking about their work. And there are about as many opinions on this as there are people who have thought about these issues. And maybe you all won't agree exactly with all the things that I say, but that's all right. Part of doing good science is, facing disagreement. So here are a couple of things I think we should be careful of doing. So imagine you're a scientist, you've invented some fancy new cure for cancer, and you're thinking, what's the lasting impact of this achievement going to be? Well, if Jesus is coming back to make all things new, there's not going to be any cancer at some point in the future, right? There isn't going to be any cancer left to cure, right? In the new heavens and the new earth, there isn't going to be any need for cures for cancer. So that might be an initial sort of, I guess this, if I'm going into science to make a lasting impact, maybe this is a little bit discouraging. Now, there's maybe a way you could think about this, and some people do want to think about it this way, kind of get out of this quandary by saying, well, think about it this way, right? We have to get from here to there. We have to get from here, a world riddled with cancer, to a world that has no cancer. So maybe science is about bringing about that new creation, right? Maybe science is about developing better and better cures for cancer so that one day we'll have pushed cancer off to the sidelines and eventually eradicated it completely. And then that's one way in which God's kingdom will have come on earth. I don't want us to think about it this way, though, either, mostly because I just don't see enough evidence in the Bible for that. It seems very difficult to determine what exactly is going to carry over from this creation to the new creation, and we're reminded constantly in, say, the book of Ecclesiastes, that our work here really does have a temporary character, and it doesn't have ultimate significance. So there's a downside to this, which is maybe you're bummed out by the fact that it's great scientific, technological achievements that you do or that you're excited about humanity doing, you're excited about, Elon Musk doing, right? They're not going to last. They're not nearly as important as we sometimes make them out to be. But there's an upside to this too, which is our failures as scientists, engineers, doctors don't have ultimate significance either, right? If you're a scientist and you spend a decade researching a new cure for cancer and then it just doesn't work out, because sometimes it doesn't work out, you haven't failed God, right? You haven't failed to bring about the coming of God's kingdom. It doesn't, rest on our shoulders. So, how do we think about our work then, as scientists? The answer is deceptively simple, I think, right? Why do scientists do scientists? Well, we're ultimately motivated by love. Why do Christian scientists do do science? Because we're motivated by love, motivated by care for our fellow human beings, a desire to alleviate suffering and make the world temporarily, right, a little bit better of a place. So now you might think, well, yeah, but doesn't everybody do this, right? Non-Christian scientists also have very noble motivations for doing their science, right? And it's true, they do. But there's a distinctive character to Christian love, which I'd like to talk a little bit more deeply about here, right? So there are a lot of things that we call loving in this world. There are a lot of things that we call loving in our culture. And there are a lot of, even Christians do this, right? And there are a lot of things that are, in fact, loving. But at the end of the day, we have to ask the question, what determines whether an act, whether a motivation, or whatever else is loving? And the answer that the world gives, I guess, the answer that we often are instinctively disposed to give is something like, well, it feels good. Things feel loving. It's ultimately our feelings or something like that maybe even our motivations, right? Oh, there's sort of a noble character to particular acts. Those are the things that make things loving. But Christians have a way of telling whether things are loving that doesn't just rely on feelings, right? We have, well, let's read, I have here, this is under B2:2, a quote from 1 John chapter 2. Right? Those who obey God's word truly show how completely they love him. That's how we know we're living in him. Those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did. So there are two ways we see here that we can determine whether acts are in fact loving or not. I've underlined them, right? The Bible is teaching us what it is to love by telling us God's commands explicitly, and also by showing us the example of Jesus Christ. Okay, so there is a sort of, maybe not a definition of love, but a method of telling what is and isn't loving. How is this relevant then to the scientist as she goes about her work as a scientist? Well, the main thing I want to talk about today is ethical dilemmas that pop up. So they pop up all the time. And in all of our lives, but scientists have plenty of them to face, and sometimes the stakes are quite high. I mentioned Oppenheimer earlier, right? Maybe some people would be uncomfortable with, some scientists, some engineers, whatever, would be uncomfortable with their work being used for certain military applications. In the medical field, there are always various kinds of controversies and dilemmas that medical researchers are facing. I was going to say that this might be an example that's too old for people, but I think actually for most people in this room, it rings loud and clear. So back in the 2000s, there were all these debates over embryonic stem cell research, right? On the one hand, you have the great promise that this kind of research has for developing new treatments for diseases. But on the other hand, you're destroying human embryos to accomplish that. And the question is sort of which is more valuable, all the lives that could be saved or improved as a result of the research, or the lives, and indeed, right, part of the question that was on the table is whether they are lives that would be sacrificed in the pursuit of those discoveries. And this is, George Bush signed the executive order which put a stop to this research. Obama reinstated it or something like that. This was kind of actually before my time, so many of you will know this better than I do. They both used their faith as motivating factors in this. Bush talked about how we're given life. Life is a gift from the Creator. Barack Obama said, as a person of faith, I think we should be thinking about all the good that this research could do, right? Okay, there are also some more mundane things that people face in other scientific disciplines. So in college, I worked at a startup I was doing some machine learning research. We were building cashierless stores. Think like Amazon Go, if you're familiar with that. I just found out recently, actually, that Amazon Go is discontinuing the cashierlessness of their automated stores. My startup the startup I worked at went out of business too, so maybe this was just not the thing to be doing. But one of the key parts of our technology is we want to be as good as possible at tracking people, building a profile for them as they move around the store so that we can identify our customers. And these are in actual brick and mortar stores, right? And build a profile around them so that we can more effectively get money from them. And you might think that there are maybe some privacy issues involved in that. It wasn't lost on me at the time, but I didn't really think about these things, in part because when we go about lives making decisions like what job to do or what field to go into or what scientific research to do, we often are blind to the various ethical issues that we face, right? We take the job because it's experience or it's money or we like the people who are working there or whatever else, right? So the point is that I'm not saying that building cashierless stores that track and exploit their customers is bad. I'm not saying that building bombs is bad. I'm not saying that destroying embryos is bad necessarily, right? These are dilemmas, right? So there's never a cost-free solution to them. The answers aren't going to be easy. But the thing that makes the Christian unique among the Christian scientist, unique among scientists facing these dilemmas, is that the Christian scientist has recourse to the Bible to answer the questions, to tell them what it is that is loving to do. Except that it's really not ever that easy, is it? There are a couple of reasons why, even for Christians, there aren't going to be obvious answers to a lot of these things. One of the reasons for this is that the Bible rarely explicitly addresses the particular issues that are at stake. So if we're thinking about God's commands and Jesus' example, right, you don't open to Philippians 1 and you have Paul, an apostle, I am great, I'm joyful that the gospel is going forth in the emperor's household. Be of one mind in Christ. By the way, don't do embryonic stem cell research because destroying embryos are human lives, and to destroy one is to take a life. Remember my chains, etc. And similarly, in Jesus' example, you don't open to the Gospel of John and get the story where Jeff Bezos comes up to Jesus and offers him a job doing AI research at a privacy-invading enterprise, and Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." So there's this problem that there is always going to be, if you want to know whether stealing is wrong, you could find explicit commands about that in the Bible. But it's not always going to be nearly that simple. There's another reason why it's difficult for Christian scientists to apply the Bible in practice, and that's that they have to work with non-Christian scientists too. Right? Science isn't an exclusively Christian enterprise, nor do I think it should be. If I'm sick, I want the best doctor, not necessarily the Christian doctor, to care for me. If I'm driving over a bridge, I want the best engineer to have built it, not necessarily the Christian engineer. Right? So it should be a joint enterprise with non-Christians. But with that comes the problem of, well, we have to get along, we have to work together, we have to be able to communicate across that divide, because non-Christians aren't necessarily going to see the Bible in the same way that we do. I can tell you from experience. So how does the Christian Scientist approach living a life of love informed by the Bible in their research? And I think the answer here is it's not easy, and it's not like the Bible, we can just treat the Bible like a manual that you pull off the shelf, blow off the dust, flip to the appendix and find the page number where your issue is addressed, and then put it back on the shelf until a few months down the line when you need to address some new ethical issue that confronts you. The only way we're going to be good at applying the Bible to the ethical issues that confront us today as scientists and engineers and doctors and whatever else is if we're actually reading the Bible, making a habit of reading the Bible, and beyond that, studying the Bible, having conversations with other Christians and non-Christians maybe about the Bible, going to church and hearing it preached, praying, partaking in the sacraments, the things that Jesus has given us to shape our minds and help us understand the Bible. So there aren't any shortcuts to this, right? Christian Scientists should be always reading their Bible. In fact, that's one of the main takeaways from this talk. You didn't really need to come here to hear me say Christians should be reading their Bibles, but you didn't pay any money for this either, so it's all good. And so, right, maybe you've heard that, right, and so then as our minds are shaped by the Bible, we start to be able to see the world through biblical lenses. We start to understand issues in biblical terms, sometimes even if we can't point to chapter and verse. And we're able to better communicate our convictions of what it is that's loving to do, as informed by the Bible, to non-Christians, even if the non-Christians themselves don't necessarily submit to biblical authority. And the reason I think that this is true is because there's this old saying, right? If you can't explain it, you don't understand it, right? Or if you can't teach it, you don't understand it. But the contrapositive of that, which means that it's a logical implication. So, I'm a student in logic, right? So, that means a logical implication of that is if you understand something, you're going to be able to explain it. So if we strive to understand the Bible, and not just the Bible either, but the scientific issues at stake, right? We actually have to be good scientists too. And maybe if you're not a scientist, but you're interested in interacting with scientists or the scientists, right? Need to understand the scientific issues as well. But if we understand both of these, and they start to become integrated in our minds through a lot of reflection and prayer and studying, then we are going to be able to communicate effectively to non-believers why it is that these ethical issues, sometimes that these ethical dilemmas are dilemmas, and what the solution should be. And to conclude this first part of the talk, right? Here's a gospel reminder, again, in light of all of this that I've said, right? Jesus forgives our mistakes too. So one of the things about ethical dilemmas, as I said, is that there's no easy solution. And we're going to get some things wrong. So maybe you're a scientist who your research ends up getting used for military applications that just kill innocent people. Whether or not, we can debate all day long about whether or not that makes you somewhat responsible for those deaths. But the important thing is that Jesus still forgives you, even if you are responsible for those deaths. You're a scientist and you decide that it's worth it to do embryonic stem cell research. And then it turns out that it wasn't worth it. And there were lives lost and there wasn't enough gained. Jesus offers forgiveness for those mistakes too, even if we don't even realize that we've made those mistakes, right? Jesus knows us better than we know ourselves, and Jesus forgives those who come to him in faith for everything that they do, even these sorts of these things that they do in ignorance, or perhaps for lack of enough understanding of the issues at stake. And I think that's a really important thing to remember as scientists. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit more about what minds shaped by the Bible look like. And to do that, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about what minds that aren't necessarily shaped by the Bible look like. Winding back the clock a few minutes, I was talking about maybe the point of science is to usher in the new creation, right? We are developing cures for cancer that are going to be the reason that there is no cancer in the new creation. Actually, a lot of non-Christian scientists love this idea too. Now, they don't call it the new creation, right? They don't think that there's a God who's coming to make all things new. But they do view the promise of human scientific and technological achievement as an ultimate goal of history in sort of the way that we Christians view the coming kingdom of God, right? As we develop more cures for cancer, eventually there won't be any more cancer. As we develop greater and greater feats of of engineering, eventually we're going to be living among the stars, and we're going to defeat all of the various ways in which people suffer today. Eventually we're going to defeat death, but also, poverty and all of these things using our science. Which sounds pretty good, but first of all, it's not the Christian gospel, right? That's not the Christian hope. More than that, it's not even a gospel, right? So the gospel is good news. It does sound pretty great to live in a world free of suffering and in this sort of techno utopia. Maybe to some people it does. I have a lot of friends who are into this, so I've come to understand the point of view, I think, pretty well. So maybe it's good, but it's not good news, right? What makes the Christian gospel good news is that it reports things that have happened, are happening, and will happen, definitely, right? Jesus lived, died, rose again. Jesus is giving us his Spirit. Jesus is coming to make all things new. These are things that actually happened. These are things that actually will happen, and it's news, right? It's a report to you that this has happened. That's a gospel. The techno-futurists don't have a gospel at all. Instead, they have a vision of what things could be like, but they also have a warning that it's not necessarily going to be like that. Right? If we do a good enough job, the world might be saved. But we have to do a good job, and the stakes are incredibly high if we don't. So to illustrate this, Toby Ord, he's a philosopher at Oxford, sharp guy, very, very smart guy, a thought leader in this sort of techno-futurist movement, as well as other related movements like effective altruism. He wrote a book that was published in 2020, shortly before the pandemic happened, called The Precipice, I would recommend putting it on your reading list if you're interested in these things. It's a great read. And in it, he gives a prediction that there's a 1 in 6 chance that the human species drives itself to extinction in the next century. And we're talking about extinction here, like no more humans, not that we blow ourselves back to the Stone Ages and then eventually recover, right? So 1 in 6, what does that look like? So those are Russian roulette odds, right? So I have a die here, which has 6 sides. 1 in 6 is the probability that the die, when I roll it, lands on a 1, right? Or for that matter, a 2, but I'll just use 1, right? 5 and 6, which is our chances of not going extinct in the next century, is if it lands on a 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 altogether, 2 through 6. Okay, so I warned Randy that this was going to happen. Do you have an ethical or religious objection to gambling, Randy? Yes. You do? Are you serious? Yes. Okay. Who doesn't have an ethical or religious? Okay. You're in the aisle. I'm going to go to the person who's actually in the aisle. Okay. No, I think there should be real money at stake here because that's what gets us to actually think carefully about what it feels like to have a 1 in 6 chance of something happening. Do you carry cash, or I could Venmo? Okay. So I'm going to put $1 on the die landing on the 1. How much would you put up for the die landing on the 2 through 6? $1. Okay. I'm pretty sure that I think that. Yeah. Okay. That was the other. I should probably have asked that question too. Okay. Well, we can do it for $1. Vegas odds I think are $5. Really?
You're the house, so.
Seriously? Okay. Okay. All right. So and are you willing to bet $5 that this die lands on a 2 through a 6? All right. Okay. So I'm just gonna you can examine this. It's an acrylic die. You got to tell lies in church earlier. Now we're gambling in church. So you can sort of see if there are any imperfections that might weight it. I chose 1 arbitrarily, but if there's a side that you would prefer it to me to wager on, that's fine. But other than that, you can just roll it. It turns out that a lot of the bias in these chance devices comes from the person who's operating them. So again, I'm just making this as fair as possible. Is humanity going to survive? We survived! It's a 4. All right, so since you spotted him, all right, I give it to the broke person. Okay, so, great. I have Venmo too, but okay. So what's the point in this? Well, I don't know what the point of that was really, but I did want you all to think about what it means. So we're laughing, we're having fun. What it means to face down a 1 in 6 chance that the species goes extinct. Probably not many of you would play Russian roulette, which I said earlier has the same odds, right? Though there are probabilities of dying that we take on ourselves very willingly. I got in my car to drive here today. The probability that I died in an accident or something like that is, not 0, but I was willing to take that risk. So there are risks that we're willing to take, but 1 in 6 it's a pretty high number. If 1 in 6 people who got COVID died, maybe we would have taken it even more seriously than we did. So, okay, how do these numbers break down? Well, it's a combination of a number of things, right? So there are the classic dangers, nuclear war, 1 in 1,000 chance of wiping us out. Again, not 1 in 1,000 chance that it happens and that we end up getting, blown to the Stone Ages with a couple thousand humans left, and it takes us centuries to recover any semblance of technology or anything like that. 1 in 1,000 chance that we are wiped out as a species. Climate change has about the same risk. Again, not a 1 in 1,000 chance that climate change causes enormous suffering in the coming 100 years, but just 1 in 1,000 that climate change actually drives the species to extinction. And then some of the other ones, bioengineered pandemics. So natural pandemics are not nearly as bad as the ones that humans themselves can come up with and use in biological warfare. So that's a 1 in 30 chance of driving us to extinction, not a 1 in 30 chance that we have a super COVID that causes half the population to die or something like that. A 1 in 30 chance that we go extinct because of a super COVID. And then the biggest one is a 1 in 10 chance that artificial intelligence drives us extinct. Not a 1 in 10 chance that artificial intelligence overpowers humanity and rules for 1,000 years with us in subjugation to it, which they believe is a live possibility too. A 1 in 10 chance that it wipes us out completely. So that means in the 9 in 10 worlds where that doesn't happen are all of those other terrible worlds where AI rules for 1,000 years and stuff like that. So anyway, my point is this isn't good news, right? This isn't so much a gospel. You don't go to church to hear your pastor recite these kinds of predictions for you, right? So already you can see how the gospel might be something of an attractive alternative to this point of view. What I want to talk about before I kind of conclude by talking more about why the gospel is an attractive alternative, I want to talk a little bit about why we got here. And I think, from judging from the friends that I have and that I talk to and that I love very much, I think the answer is really a lot of science fiction, whether books or media of whatever sort, right? And the reason, right, my friends spend their time consuming all this science fiction. And when you do that, the worlds that are depicted start to become more vivid to you. And then they start to become more plausible because you start to understand how things would work better. After having all these conversations with friends, I understand how a techno-utopia ruled by a benevolent AI God, what it might look like, because they've explained it to me. Science fiction paints very vivid pictures that make things more plausible, and then depending on how things are depicted, they might become desirable to some people or terrifying, or maybe simultaneously both. I think a lot of people in these circles are equally terrified of AI as they think that it's the secret to unlocking a beautiful future for humanity in which there's no more pain and suffering. As Christians, how should we think about these things? Well, big surprise, my answer to this one is put down the science fiction and read the Bible. Now, I have nothing against science fiction. It's maybe not my favorite genre, but I think, we should be reading, actually, yeah, I do think we should be reading the science fiction too. I think we should be reading Christian science fiction. I think we as Christians should be encouraging people to write Christian science fiction to help us think in these categories, think imaginatively in these categories. I called this part of the talk a baptized imagination. That's a callback to C.S. Lewis, right, who described how reading the fiction of George MacDonald baptized his imagination years before the rest of him was baptized. I think there's a place, not just for scientific research, but for scientific communication, which comes in many forms, including ones that speak to our imaginations. And again, right, so yes, put down the sci-fi and read more of the Bible, but that doesn't mean put down the sci-fi really, because you should also be reading the sci-fi. And it also doesn't mean just settle for reading the Bible. As I said before, studying the Bible, praying to the Spirit to give you understanding, going to church and hearing it preached, being in fellowship and having conversations with people about the Bible are all part of what I mean by reading the Bible. And again, really, right, this isn't a call to ignorance. There's a reason I recommended that you read The Precipice, right? Because we have to understand both the biblical perspective on things and the perspective on things that these very, very smart and well-informed people have about these matters, right? And I just want to, throw out sort of speculatively, this was actually first suggested to me by a very non-Christian friend of mine who wanted me to get more into this stuff and wanted to kind of speak to me as speak to what he perceived as Christian motivations for some of these things. But I think that there's a grain of truth to it, right? The Bible uses categories like 1,000 years or even 1,000 generations, which is an order of magnitude longer than 1,000 years, to describe the span of humanity's existence. And that includes, ancient Israel, which was already thousands of years ago, right? It includes us today in the church age. And it might include us, humans, in the year 3000 or beyond. Who knows how long it might be until Jesus comes back, and what sorts of things might transpire in our history until then, what things we might be able to accomplish until then. And this brings me to sort of the concluding point, another gospel reminder that even if we still have 10,000 more years to live on this earth, and 1,000 of those are ruled by a benevolent AI, or maybe not so benevolent AI, or AI-led technocracy that comes about to power after nuclear war blows us back to the Stone Ages and a pandemic ravages us. No matter what might happen in the future, Jesus is coming back. And what that means is that we don't live in one of those, in those 1 in 6 worlds where humanity goes extinct, right? Humanity isn't going to go extinct. Jesus is going to come back. Because he's going to come back, that implies that there's actually going to be a world for him to come back to, right? And, well, that's an important reminder, because it's not that there aren't the potential for enormous amounts of suffering in the future or enormous good that science and technology might give us. I think there probably will be a lot of suffering and a lot of great achievements ahead of us in the future. But it does mean that the existence of the human species doesn't rest on any of our shoulders, right? That's not up to us. There's great work for us to be doing here, but we don't need to be thinking in the category of extinction. Yeah, we don't need to be thinking in these extinction categories. Yeah, so that's I think why the gospel provides a hopeful alternative. Not just that we don't go extinct, right, but that there is a glorious return of Christ one day, even if there's a lot of stuff ahead of us in our history. So until then, we have a lot of work to be doing as scientists and engineers and doctors and all of that stuff. And let's get to it. Okay, that's, I think, the top.
I'd like to shorten our break, just a few minutes to stretch, introduce yourself to the person next to you as Derek or Shmawi makes his way forward. And just to, then we'll take a 10-minute break after his talk before the Q&A. So yeah, stretch your legs, introduce yourself. We're so glad you're here.
Thanks. Thanks.
You got us all gambling, it's sick.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
It's,
even,
what?
you even quoted a Christian universalist. Or you pointed to one. That was astonishing, guys. You put your mic away for that.
Yeah. Why don't we walk to the back and I'll unhook myself because I don't really want to be wearing this for the next.
Thank you for the dollar. Please do.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Killed it.
Thanks. George MacDonald. Ah, yes. I referenced him.
You famously turned with loathing from the God of Death, John Lennon.
Interesting.
No, hey, great. I'm giving you a hard time.
I didn't even ask your name.
That was so good. That was such a good. Okay, good. Yeah,
Let me unwire myself real quick. Okay.
All right.
Can I take this off
No,
for
you're
now?
gonna keep it on.
Okay. Well,
because
yeah.
you'll need it for the final part. So
You're not off for
Should I-
head jack.
Does that turn me off? Or that's just the mute? Okay, well that works. Okay.
nobody's listening. I will definitely.
Oh,
not turn
yeah,
on.
you're not going to turn me on.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to need to remember to actually unmute it. And I'm going to have to rewire myself.
Don't mute it.
Okay.
Just leave it not muted.
Okay.
Cool. You don't have to run up there and say, your microphone's muted.
Yeah.
You don't want that.
So you're Daniel. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Are you a student or?
Yes, I'm a college student.
At?
El Camino College in Torrance.
How did you hear about that? Are you a member of this church? Or? Okay, so new. Are you new to the area? Or?
Testing. Well, if you could take your seats. Well, I am very, very, very excited to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Derek Rishmawi, who is the RUF campus minister at UC Irvine. He is currently completing his PhD in systematic theology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and is the co-host of the Mere Fidelity podcast. And if I'm not mistaken, he still has his blog site, derekishmawi.com at Reformedish. Is that? It's still there. Okay. And he and his wife McKenna and their 2 toddlers live in Newport Beach. And I'm just very thankful for Derek's ministry at RUF at Irvine, as well as to the larger church. The way that I was introduced to him was not only his blog posts, but also his interview during the As in Heaven podcast on one of the more recent books on the Great De-Churching. And so it was just a really, really helpful interview with him, and we're really glad to have him. And so if you would, without further ado, Derek Oshmawi.
Thank you. Once again, you have heard my name is Derek Oshmawi, but I'm going to say it anyways because it's written right there in my notes. I am a campus minister, which is to say I'm a pastor who works with college students at UC Irvine. And for that reason, I got asked to be on a small panel a few months ago. And when I say small, it was a very small panel in a classroom at Chapman University. And it was me and 2 rabbis and a Muslim. And that sounds like the setup to a joke, but it was really just, 2 rabbis, a Muslim, and a Presbyterian. And we walked in this class, and it was a wide-ranging discussion for about an hour and a half with college students and the professor about the future of religion, things like that. And at one point, one student popped up his hand and asked us essentially like, hey, are y'all afraid of us? Are you scared of us? And I was like, why? He's like, well, we're so committed to, our generation is so committed to reason and science and logic. And that's not what you guys are into. And my first response was like, I've seen your TikToks. I'm not sure how into reason and science with all the astrology you're into. But on top of that, though, I'm not scared. On a more serious note, the student's question was sincere, though. Right? What he was tapping into was a long-standing trope that's out there in our culture about an alleged conflict, a standing conflict between religion and science, especially Christianity and science. And that trope's been with us for a long time. It's been with us at least since the philosophical movement known as the Enlightenment, where philosophers and scientists argued that we needed to throw off the shackles of tradition and authority and kind of dare. Immanuel Kant has this famous essay, Dare to Know, like dare to throw off the encumbrances of like an earlier stage in human existence where we were children and we had to be taught things, but now we can reason for ourselves, we can know ourselves, we can get out there beyond tradition and beyond theology and beyond what the church has been kind of teaching us. And so the idea is that in the face of this tradition, we take this bold gambit to throw off mystery, to throw off blind faith, to throw off the power-hungry church, and to avoid being the doped up masses of sheep-like believers in religion, which is an opiate for us. It dulls our senses. It dulls us to the reality of truth and life, and it makes us cope, but it keeps us from growing up, as it were, right? And so, scared of a heliocentric universe, the church opposed Galileo and Copernicus. It was scared of evolution, so it opposed Darwin, and so on and so forth. This kind of view, this kind of narrative was famously put in more than a couple of books, but John William Draper synthesized it in a book just simply called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, right? And so it's out there. It's been it's a meme that's been out in the cultural waters for centuries, and it's not just religion in general. It's Christianity in particular, right? Evolution, for many, has made biblical accounts of human origins and the creation of the species coming directly from God's hand seem wildly out of date. Widely held dominant accounts of geology and astronomy make the alleged timeline of biblical narratives of creation seem inaccurate, right? The idea of a 6,000-year-old world, so on and so forth. And it seems like really the whole method of knowing things is opposed, right? On one side, you have reason, evidence, observation. On the other side, you have faith and trust and ancient, unverifiable books that you're just supposed to take at face value with little thought about the actual world, right? Steven Pinker, he's a well-known kind of pop philosopher, popularizer of science, puts it this way: the findings of science imply that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures are factually mistaken, right? So tell us how you really feel, right? Alex Rosenberg is another philosopher and scientist, puts it this way: there's so much more to atheism than its knockdown arguments that there is no God. There's the whole rest of the worldview that comes along with atheism. It's a demanding, rigorous, breathtaking grip on reality, one that has been vindicated beyond reasonable doubt. It's called science, right? So he just identifies this totalizing worldview that's opposed to faith with it's just science. It's just science. That's a bold claim, but it's one I think, again, many simply take for granted, and it comes for granted in a lot of the conversations I do have with students when we sit down and talk over coffee, or even some of their professors. I mean, professors that I had at UC Irvine in some of our bio classes, not all of them, but some of them. There was just this assumption that there's this tension there, a worldview, an understanding of reality that's just generated by science, especially the hard sciences, the STEMs, like chemistry, biology, physics, and so on and so forth. One is thinking and the other is feeling. Right? What I'd like to do today is just sort of challenge this claim by doing something that I hope is intriguingly bold and unexpected, which is to put my pastor hat on for a minute, because I am just a pastor. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a scientist. But what I want to do is look at a text in the scriptures, Genesis chapter 1, the very first and maybe the most controversial chapter in the Bible on these matters, and actually show that Christianity and the Bible themselves give us deep resources for the practice of science. Now, what I won't do is answer a bunch of the specific questions that people might like me to in a lecture on Genesis 1, questions around evolution or the age of the earth. They're important questions, but I don't actually think that's the most fundamental thing that Genesis 1 is after, nor that it gives resources for science for it. There totally can be. That's not something I'm going to be hitting today. What I want to show, though, out of Genesis 1 is that far from being opposed, Christianity gives deep resources for the practice of science itself as a discipline and as a domain of knowledge. So what I'm going to argue is that the theology, the view of God and the world and the human person that are taught in Genesis 1 is exactly what we need to go about practicing science in a meaningful and responsible way. There's a philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga, and he's got a great book on all this. I'm stealing a lot from. And what he says is, at first it may appear there's a deep conflict between Christianity and science, but at the end of the day, when you really look at it, it's merely superficial. There's actually a deep concord between the two. And so what I want to say is I'm going to argue four things. Genesis 1 teaches us that Christianity and really the truth of the gospel, or the assumptions that the gospel has, give us the metaphysical foundation, the epistemological grounds, the moral boundaries, and like the doxological goal. I'll explain all this. The doxological goal that's necessary for science to proceed. So don't worry, I'm going to go through those one by one, and I'm going to do those in order. But in order for that to happen, I'm going to do what pastors typically do, which is take out my Bible. If you have a phone Bible or you just want to Google Genesis 1, that's fine. You don't need to. It actually might be beneficial if you just hear the text read. I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to get into my points. So here now, the reading of Genesis 1. Now, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place. Let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruits in which there is seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years. Let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. It's the word of the Lord. Go ahead and bow your heads and pray. Holy Father, you are good and you are true. And we pray right now that you would help us to understand what we have read and be edified by it, and to be challenged by your truth, to be conformed to it, and to understand it and really you in a deeper way. We pray all these things in Christ's name. All right. So before I get to my first point, I want to just a little bit of Genesis and context. What you have to understand about the Bible is a book of books, and it's a book of a lot of different kinds of books. And even within certain books, there's different kinds of things going on with them. And what I'm saying is that there's several genres in Scripture. There's different kinds of narratives, different kinds of texts. There's law, there's historical narratives, there's poetry, there's letters, there's There's all these sorts of things going on, and you read them according to their own rules. Now, with Genesis 1, what you have is a very unique kind of text. I think it's history. I think it's actually recording what God did in time and space, in creating time and space. And yet, it's not straight history in the same way that one of the narratives of the life of Abraham or the Gospels is. It's told with a slightly elevated and poetic style, with rhythm and glory. And we're going to talk about that. In order, it's almost a hymn. And so something's going on here that's trying to tell you history, but it's not just, hey, here's a video recording history. It's deep history. It's theological history. It's meaning laden. And so what it's trying to do in a very condensed space is give you the foundations, the foundational truths about God, the world, and humanity. Right? So that's very important to keep in mind here. And with this in mind, what I want to do is I want to point out a few features of the text that will help us get to our first point here, which is the way Genesis 1 gives us the metaphysical grounds for the practice of science. Right? So first, there's this basic picture of what's happening. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth. And right there in that phrase, the heavens and the earth, there's things we could go into there, but most scholars will tell you that's a merism. That's a phrase that indicates, the heavens and the earth and everything in between. God is authoring and creating all things. So right off the bat, we have some very important metaphysical data. First, the first thing we learn off of these first few verses is that before there was the heavens and the earth, that is the space-time universe, there was a God, right? This God, being the author and the creator of heaven and earth, is a being who transcends heaven and earth, transcends space and time, transcends all limitations. He's the author of all that he has made, and so he is not one of the things that he has made, right? And so right off the bat, and the whole rest of the Bible backs up this distinction, you have this very important metaphysical distinction that's given to us, is that there's God, and then there's all the stuff that God made. There's the creator, and then there's the creation, right? The world, in that way, the world is not divine, but the world is the result and the choice and the action of what is designed. So there's a distinction between God and the world. Right off the bat, you've ruled out a very important metaphysical view called pantheism. We'll get to that later. Second, how does this God who made all things make all things? Well, the text says, and God said, and it was so. We hear that phrase repeated several times. So in other words, how does this God make things? He does it by the power of his word, by speech. He speaks and things come into existence. He doesn't take, what he doesn't do, what you don't have a picture of, you don't have a picture of this big powerful God taking stuff that's already there, pre-existing eternal matter, and reshaping it into what he wants. That's not the picture you have. What you have is actually someone speaking and then something that wasn't there coming into existence. What did not exist now exists because the one who has always existed wills that it exist. Right? He just says stuff and it comes into existence. So he's pictured really as a great king who is decreeing things and they come to pass. This is very different than a lot of other ancient Near Eastern creation narratives. You've got the very famous one called the Enuma Elish, and you might have heard about it in your undergrad or whatever it is. And that, there's a lot of different creation stories. This one's kind of fun. You have essentially a battle between a lot of gods. There's already a world. There's already stuff going on. You have this battle between a lot of gods. It's honestly like the Avengers and Thanos a little bit. But what happens is you get this high god who kills another god who's really a beast, Tiamat, and he rips open the body of this other beast and creates the world out of its body and out of its blood, creates humans in order to serve the gods because they're tired and that sort of thing. It's a whole wild story, but this picture couldn't be farther from what we get in this passage. There's no competition. There's no violence. There's just God says, and it is. All right? Third, this leads us to notice the next feature of the text. There's a basic rhythm, order, symmetry, and beauty to the passage, reflecting a rhythm, order, beauty, and symmetry to the way God creates and to what God creates. Scholars will note several points about the text, but several words and formula are repeated throughout it. varying ways, but one of the numbers that comes up over and over again is 7 and multiples of 7. So, and it was so. God saw that it was good. Naming and blessing, the mention of the days, that's all repeated 7 times. God is meant, the name, the word God is mentioned 35 times. Again, a multiple of 7. Earth and heaven are mentioned 21 times, multiples of 7. 7 in the scriptures in the Hebrew mind is just the number of completeness. And right off the bat, what you see here is this narrative is giving us a picture of an orderly, completed, symmetrical, rhythmic cosmos, right? Beyond that, there's a basic logical order to the days, right? The first 3 days, God creates what are known as kind of realms, areas, heaven, waters, land. And the next 3 days, he fills these realms with rulers and inhabitants, the sun, moon, and the stars, the beasts of the deep, and vegetation, animals, and especially humans, finally culminating in a day of rest. There's an order within it. The sun and the moon and the stars are placed in the sky in order to what? Mark the regular passage of time, seasons for planting and reaping, and also for ancient Israel for worshiping the true God. This is fascinating because in the ancient Near Eastern mind, the sun and the moon and the stars were often deities. They were often divine beings, and what the Bible is saying is, in fact, these are not divine beings. These are beings placed there by the divine, by the one God, in order to tell you what time you're supposed to worship him. They're your clocks. You're welcome, right? For our purpose, we could keep going here for a while because Genesis 1 is just a lot of fun. But for our purpose, I want you to understand that all of this paints a portrait of a universe that is uniquely suited for the practice of the empirical sciences to work at all. So let's stop and think about that for a minute. For the empirical sciences, for the hard sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, geology, and so forth, to work, you actually have to assume a lot about the nature of reality at the outset. As Stevenson pointed out, you don't assume doubt, you assume knowledge. You have to know things in order to get the process going at all. And these are things that are actually, well, we'll get there. Process of observation, the testing of hypotheses, inductive reason about the past and future and the present, the reliability of reality, right? The regularity of nature is something you may not have thought of on Tuesday, but it's something you depended on because you were assuming Wednesday was going to work basically the same way as Tuesday, except for the variations in your schedule. Which is to say, inductive reasoning, which we already talked about a little bit, works like this: every day before today, the sun has risen. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Therefore, I will obey my alarm, get up, and go to work. Right? Now, we just assume that reality works like that, because it always has, but this is the kind of thing that kept some people up at night. There's a philosopher by the name of David Hume who's very famously worried about stuff like that. Right? We often think, hey, every crow I've ever seen up to now has been black, so all crows must be black. That works until you spot an albino crow. And therefore now, not every crow is black. Usually crows are black. What else might happen? Why else there might be a difference? Why does reality seem repeatable? See, this assumes this regularity to reality. And we've already talked about this, but part of the way science works, the practice of real science works, is through the verification and testing of hypotheses, and then the replication of those hypotheses through more tests. But what replication, the process of repeating an experiment, testing it, making sure this wasn't just a one-off fluke, an albino crow, a conclusion, is that there is something like a law-like regularity to nature. Right? That's why we often call them laws of nature. There's a physicist by the name of Paul Davies who puts it this way: even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith, in other words, an assumption, the existence of a law-like order in nature that is at least in part comprehensible to us. We'll get to that back part of that. But what this physicist points out is all of this is all largely borrowed from a theological point of view, right? The idea that the world operates according to laws assumes that there's a lawgiver who ordered it that way, right? And this is where the whole history of the conflict between science and religion, you come to see it's actually a farce. it starts to break down. If you want a good book on that, there's one called Flat Earths and Fake Footnotes by a chap named Derek Peterson. He kind of tracks down just what's wrong with that whole narrative. But you start to look at the rise of the empirical sciences in the West, since about 1600 or so, and you start to realize that the leading scientists in all of those, they were all practicing Christians. They were all Orthodox or semi-Orthodox believers. Galileo was Roman Catholic. Francis Bacon was a believer who thought atheism was obviously false given the deliverances of science. Robert Boyle, the originator of Boyle's Law, was an Orthodox Christian who wrote Bible commentaries. Sir Isaac Newton was Newton. He wrote the Principia, but he also wrote like wild and weirdo commentaries on the book of Revelation and Daniel. He was not actually an Orthodox believer, he was kind of a heretic, potentially on the Trinity, but he thought it was manifestly obvious that the whole world had been ordered by a wise and divine sovereign mind, the Christian God, in fact. Right? You can keep going down today. Faraday was a Christian. James Clerk Maxwell, one of the unifiers of physics, was a Christian. Evangelical Presbyterian, elder in the Church of Scotland. So, hooray for the Presbyterians. I could keep going, but the philosophers of science will point out, who know the history of the science will tell you it's not an accident that the modern sciences, as we know them now, developed in Judeo-Christian countries where this basic view of reality was operative. It was basically under the assumptions of the Judeo-Christian God, maybe along with a little bit of the influence of Greek thought, with the idea of a logos and an order to all things, is the instinct to see the world as something orderly and rational and consistent that could be studied and understood and reliable because it was the work and art and continued project of a rational, reliable, faithful God who created all things and maintained all things in existence. Right? Science is not possible of the sort that we're talking about if you think reality is the result of the work of many gods, many principles, many sources. Or if you think, hey, honestly, the world popped into existence, it has these constants, we don't actually know where it came from. If your big theory of reality is it just is because it is, it could just not be the way it is the next moment. That's no way to live. But metaphysically, philosophically, before you even start writing your hypotheses, you assume there's connections between causes and effects. And we're going to get to that in a little bit. But what I'm trying to say here is metaphysically, you have to act as if you live in an orderly universe where there's a God who has authored and sustains the whole thing. And what Genesis 1 is gives you a metaphysical portrait for why you ought to believe that's true. And this is, I think, the first gift that it gives to science is a metaphysical foundation for its very practice, right? The second thing that flows from this, I'm calling epistemological grounds, are basically how you know, how you think, what you think. And this logically follows, because the two kind of link up together, is essentially, how can you trust there's a match between the world outside and your perceptions of it? Right? How is there a match between your reason, and not just your perceptions, but the way you think about things, your reason, your logic, and reality? Let's think about another angle on the same problem. Dutch theologian Herman Bavinck, who's got a great little book called Christianity and Science, it just got translated. He puts it this way: all scientific research assumes in advance and without proof the reliability of the senses and the objectivity of the perceivable world. And again, he puts it this way: it further assumes concepts such as thing, property, cause, effect, law, condition, time, space, truth, falsehood, that all of those hold out there in the world just like they hold in our brains. Right? Bavinck is noting that the practice of science assumes that reality seems to fit with the way our mind reasons, like logic and the law of non-contradiction. These are concepts that seem to come preloaded within our minds. The idea that every effect has a cause. There's another philosopher who puts it this way, Mitch Stokes. He kind of argues, we live in a user-friendly universe. Right? We know we have purchase on it. One of the weird things that he points out in his book, another good one, A Shot of Faith to the Head. I highly recommend that, especially if you have a student in these areas. He says, points out it's weird that reality is mathematically describable. Right? Physics depends on math, like really, really weird math that I see some of my students doing and I have no idea how it works. But the idea is, Albert Einstein was amazed at this. He says, at this point, an enigma presents itself, which in all ages has agitated inquiring minds. How can it be that mathematics, being after all a product of human thought, which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality? Like math pre-exists your like reasoning about reality, so you don't get the concept of 3 by like, oh, there's a 1. I mean, you teach kids this, but even if even if you've never seen 3 apples together, whatever it is, you don't reason your way up from 3 is like a concept that's always there, it's always been, and oh, look, there's 3 things. Like that's a dumb example of what I'm talking about, but math and reality cohere. Another scientist, Nobel laureate and physicist Steven Weinberg says, it is positively spooky how the physicist finds the mathematician has been there before him or her on a regular basis, right? The reality is math is not something you get, oh, I skipped that, I reverse those. I'm gonna move down a paragraph. It gets even weirder. It turns out it's not just that math can describe reality that we already know exists, it's that it can predict reality. Right? Math helps us discover things. So you can figure out a mathematical equation that applies to some observable phenomenon, and it turns out that you start switching the equation around in ways that hold, you can kind of describe and predict unobservable realities on its basis. Right? From what I've heard, the discovery of black holes basically operated that way. The math suggested that they were there long before we could ever prove or observe that they were. The math was just right and elegant and beautiful. And since then, we've been able to come up with tools to start verifying it. That's weird. I cannot express to you how weird it is when you start to think about why math that works in our brains, independent of what we can see, describes what we see and describes what we can't yet see, but eventually turns out to be true, right? And actually, we have reason to think that this is not the case if there is no God who created the world. And this brings me to a very famous argument by the same philosopher I've been quoting a couple times, Alvin Plantinga. He's got an argument that he developed, and other people have developed different versions of it, but he calls it his evolutionary argument against naturalism. Right? A less fancy version can be found in C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. It's the argument from reason. You can go look that up. But it's essentially, his argument looks and trades on a couple of ideas, on the idea of evolution and on the idea of naturalism. Now, just note, he's not arguing against the idea of evolution. What he's arguing against is that two things, if held at the same time, undermine each other, or at least undermine one thing. So what are these two beliefs? Naturalism is the belief that basically nature and physical reality is all there is. So it's a different way, it's a different angle on talking about atheism, but essentially there's no supernatural world, there's no spirits, there's no sprites, there's no fairies, there's no God, there's no angels. Just reality is what it is, and reality is really just what's physically there, the physical dimension of things, right? Evolution is what you commonly understand it to be. It's the process of development of various life forms, including human life, through the process of chance, mutation, and natural selection, right? What Plantinga argues is take those two ideas and you put them together and you assume them both to be true at the same time, and you have very good reason to stop trusting your senses and stop trusting your capacity to reason as a way of arriving at accurate reflections of reality. Now, what's his argument? To give you a really rough summary, on evolution, assuming evolution, how did your cognitive faculties, your brain, how did all that develop? Well, what features does evolution select for? Like what traits get passed down? What alleles or genes? Assuming Mendel, what does it select for? Well, some people kind of nailed it down to about four kinds of traits that help keep you alive and keep you reproducing. It helps you do four things. It helps you fight, it helps you fly, it helps you feed, and it helps you reproduce. So these changes are the ones that are useful if they help keep you alive to pass on your genetic material. Your mind, your eyes, your ears, all of these things help you navigate the world in order to keep you alive and reproducing, right? Now, if that's the case, what you'll notice is that they don't actually guarantee that they're designed to give you a true approximation of reality. Certainly not high theoretical realities, right? You only have to have cognitive faculties that are good enough to keep you alive, right? So let me give an example that Plantinga uses. He asks you to imagine an ancient person out in the wilderness somewhere who comes to believe that every time he sees red berries on a bush, there's actually a witch doctor there waiting to curse him. And so he avoids all trees with berries with red bushes. Now, it just so happens that those red berries are poisonous, and had he eaten them, he would die and not pass on his genetic material. The belief that he had about the witch doctor in the red berry bush is false. It is inaccurate. And it nevertheless is extremely helpful for keeping him alive and reproducing. And so he reproduces, he passes on his genetic material, he actually passes on his belief, which has no contact with reality. What he's trying to get you to understand here with this example is that without God, without the idea that God is superintending and overseeing the process of evolution and natural selection in order to produce minds that have an accurate understanding of reality, minds that match up with reality, you actually have a gap. You have enough there of a gap to doubt that your cognitive faculties are aimed at truth and not just survival, right? You know plenty of people who believe delusions in order to keep themselves afloat, right? We have enough of that kind of in our lives, so that's not an insignificant challenge. Now, there's counter arguments, and there's counter arguments against those arguments. What I'm just trying to get you to understand is that there's a problem here. There is a question of the fit between our mind and the world, absent God. Now, where does Genesis 1 come in all of this? Again, Genesis 1, verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air, and so on and so forth. And he created man in his own image, right? And this part's going to be short here, but here's this reality. Genesis 1 teaches that God has created the human person in his own image. Now, what does that mean? Well, obviously, the word image implies a certain resemblance, and there's a whole bunch of going on in that resemblance we'll talk about in other points, but at base, it means that humans resemble God in significant ways, and the text implies, and the rest of what it teaches, that one of the ways that you resemble God is the rationality of your mind, right? On the Christian view, taught in Genesis 1, the mind that made your world made your mind to fit within this world. And in fact, he made your mind such that he wanted you to do something with this world. And so with the doctrine of the image of God, you actually have reasons for believing that your mind is actually suited to the world that you live in, that there's a match between what you think and what's out there, or that there can be a match. Right? And so once again, we find exactly what we need to begin to have the confidence in our capacity to study the world as it is, to discern the orderliness within it, and to experiment and replicate and do all the sorts of things that scientists are supposed to do. Right? We have reason to trust that there's a fit between the world outside of our thoughts and our thoughts because God himself made both of them. And this amounts to good epistemological grounds for the practice of science. Now, you might think that is quite enough to stop at, and that probably is, but I'm going to keep going. Metaphysical and epistemological principles are good enough to start the practice of science, but they're not enough actually to sustain it or to keep it on the rails. So what I want to suggest to you is that the sciences actually need a third thing, which is something Jack has already spoken to, but it's the idea of moral boundaries. Science needs moral boundaries, and if that isn't immediately intuitive, I just want to mention one name, Dr. Joseph Mengele. Some of you may know who he is, some of you may not. For those of you who don't, he's one of the chief doctors who was head of medical research under Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. He oversaw all sorts of fruitful research of all kinds, but he was most famous for his fruitful research, some of which wasn't, on humans in the death camps. He experimented on Jews and gypsies in order to forward Hitler's racial theories. He had studies performed on twins involving amputation, organ dissection, various forms of essentially torture and death in order to study its effects on the human body. If one twin died of a certain disease, he would have the other twin killed in order to dissect it and study if there were variations between the two. He delivered children alive and forbade them to be fed in order to see how long they would survive as an experiment, in order to observe and formulate hypotheses and replicate. We could keep going here. I'm not going to read the list I have. But here's the thing. While a bunch of his research resulted in nothing, it was just pointless torture and death, not all of Nazi research was. Right? Anti-malarial drugs like chloroquine, methadone, methamphetamines, and all sorts of things, medical research into hypothermia, hypoxia, dehydration, and more, which we have built life-saving techniques on top of, were developed with human experimentation in the concentration camps. Research like that of Dr. Joseph Mengele. This wasn't only a Nazi research thing. Research was famously performed on black men in the Tuskegee University of Alabama study to track the progress of syphilis in the lives of hundreds of black men despite there being a cure at the time. There are vaccines that have been developed. We've already talked about this again through the experimentation and development of human fetuses and cellular material from folks who did not consent and were not paid and did not submit to the research, right? All of these things are live things. Most people have some sense that this is wrong. Obviously not the people who perform these things, but I mentioned you to them now and you're uncomfortable. But you have to ask the question, why? Why is this kind of thing absolutely wrong? Especially if you can start to marshal utilitarian arguments for the lives that could be saved, the improvements that we could launch, right? It's not just related to biological research back then. I mean, there's a lot of the questions that we have right now around the ethics of cloning, the bioethics of genetic testing fetuses in utero, and what happens to them once you find out certain things are wrong with them, right? What about, the ethics of AI is getting freaky. We just keep plowing down that road of things that we can do, because somebody's going to do it. We got to be there first. Right? What if you know you're developing technologies that are used to wicked ends? What if you know there's no brakes on it? What if, there's all sorts of ethical questions here, right? Even to the more limited things like, what if you know that you're developing tech that's being used to rewire kids' brains so that you can sell more stuff? The way that consumer capitalism is a driver of the sciences, is just a whole level of things. So this is the classic question raised by movies. This is Terminator and Jurassic Park. We could do these things, but should we? Right? And ethics and morality deals with this should. Should we do it or not? Right? It's not just what people do. What do people tend to say is wrong? What will people allow us to do now? But what is always wrong and what should we never do, no matter what possible good could come from it? Right? And the question becomes, absent God, absent the view that's given to us in Scripture, what ground do we have for ever stopping? Right? And there are several answers. What grounds morality? And this would get to the basic question of moral sources. Right? Several answers could be given. One very popular one is just simply conscience, individual conscience. Our moral sense must come from our individual sense of what's right and wrong, and that's something that you and I discern through moral reflection and thinking, at which point the question becomes, okay, who made you the judge? That might be fine for what you're comfortable with, but is your conscience the driver for what your whole lab should or shouldn't be doing? Right? Well, okay, that's right. Just one person. But what about society? Society as a whole has a right to discern and rationally reflect and discuss and so on and so forth. But here's the thing. There's a difference between saying that society is reasoning together and discerning about what's absolutely true already versus society itself socially constructing and determining what's right and wrong. Right? A society on Tuesday might believe that slavery is perfectly acceptable. And then by Wednesday, it's at the 51% line in one, on Tuesday, it flips over. 3 people in your society change their mind. All of a sudden, is it now objectively wrong on Wednesday? Right? No, the idea of a socially constructed morality, that's really just a collection of individuals. Who gives them the right? Right? Well, what about evolution itself? What about the process of natural selection? What about the study of evolutionary behavior, which can tell us which behaviors are advantageous for human survival and mental health and so on? Right off the bat, you have to ask the question, where are you getting your normative ideas about what well-being and health and really just the reality that human beings surviving is a good thing? Right? That's not something you can test for. You assume at the outset humans surviving is good. That's not something science tells you. That's something you assume before you get to science. But even beyond that, when you take evolution and naturalism together, the atheistic belief that all is ultimately not here on purpose, but by chance and through happenstance, there is no inherent rational standard against which we can judge our actions. Right? If you don't care about your individual or the race's survival, then there is no pain of logical or moral contradiction if you adopt behavior that disadvantages society as a whole or everybody else except for just you in that moment. In fact, evolution and naturalism alone might leave you to favor certain immoral behaviors, right? Like violence against outgroups. There's one very controversial and famous book, I think it came out in the 70s and it's been revisited, that arguing that there were evolutionary advantages to rape in our ancestral past. That might not be good science when it comes to game theory, but it's something that was debated. It's actually an open question, right? This is why philosophers who've been working on the problem, non-believers itself, have largely conceded the point that there's no way to generate an absolutely normative ethical framework naturalistically using evolutionary theory. Paul Niedeliski and James Davison Hunter have a book on this whole process called Science and the Good, and they kind of give you the history of the development of how that conversation's gone. But just to quote a couple of folks that they quote, Owen Flanagan basically turns objective and prescriptive morality into practical and prudential judgments, which is just to say, we were looking for norms and values and practices that are best, where the best is almost always the best for such and such purpose. Which is to say, science can maybe tell you, hey, what's the best way of achieving X purpose? But it can't tell you whether or not that purpose is objectively, transcendently always good. You have to decide that ahead of time. And the best thing that we can do is figure out if the process we have, the practices we're looking at, can get you there well. Yuval Harari, he's another famous kind of historian of science. He's kind of been out there. He had a recent TEDx talk where he was talking about this whole problem of human rights. Where do human rights come from? And he basically flat out says, look, human rights are a nice story that we tell ourselves, right? You can't look at somebody, they're not objectively there in the physical structure of things. He's a naturalist. He says, look, you can't look at a person, cut them open, look at their spleen, and right next to it, there's the right to life. It's cool. It was tucked under the aorta or whatever. It's not inherent in things in a physicalist sense. And if that's all you have, they are just a nice story we tell ourselves to keep ourselves alive and from doing terrible things to each other. In which case, on naturalism, there's no way of declaring absolutely and definitively that what Mengele did was wrong and unjustifiable under any circumstances. So that's the problem. Where does that leave us? Well, again, turn again to those verses on Genesis 1 regarding the image of God. God here says that the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, humans made in his image, and this includes at least 2 things that are relevant for us here. An ethical reflection, a dominion mandate, and a clear line, which is to say, Adam and Eve are given a mandate to go out and rule the world and take dominion in the same way that God would. He says, you are supposed to go out there as my representatives. I'm the great king. You guys are like sub-kings. And your whole deal is to go out there and rule the world as I would. You're supposed to take hold of it, reshape it, which is actually a foundational principle for the practice of science. We'll talk about that next. But you're supposed to reshape it, build it, mold it, turn the forests into gardens, so on and so forth. But you're supposed to do it in a way that reflects me. You're supposed to do it in a way that's holy. You're supposed to do it in a way that's perfect. You're supposed to do it in a way that serves and doesn't dominate and doesn't abuse. Why would you abuse what I've made good for your own self-serving ends? And so there's this call for humans to go out as the image, to go out and reflect God in the way that they practice science, which is righteously, perfectly, in love, in holiness. Right? Ephesians talks about the image of God being restored in humanity as righteousness and holiness. And you look at what holiness means in all the Old Testament. It means a lot of things, but one of the things it means is love of neighbor. It's part of what Jack was talking about. Right? The next thing it does, and this is really just a corollary, is the image of God gives you a line in the sand. If you're unclear about, if you're fuzzy about the questions, there are dilemmas, as Jack mentioned. The image of God gives you a big, fat, red line that you're not supposed to cross, which is to say, anything that you do in your experiments, anything you do in your process of deliberation that degrades, abuses, misuses an image bearer, that is to say, a human being who possesses unique dignity and value coming from the hand of the Creator, is off limits. And you cannot treat an image bearer as a utilitarian means to an end. You can't say, okay, look, we can save 100,000 people if we just slaughter and torture 15 of them. Because each one of those 15 of them is a unique, transcendently worthy image bearer, stamped by God with his own face, as it were. And so there's a very clear line in the sand. And so what Genesis 1 gives the sciences is a very clear moral boundary and a very strong moral imperative. You are to practice science in my image, in recognition of my image, towards the end of my image. Right? The creep, the jitter in your soul that you felt when I described what Mengele was doing is not a leftover evolutionary impulse, a survival instinct. It is actually a reflection of the image of God who hates and recoils at the defacing of all that he's made in that way. And that is a gift that Genesis 1 gives to the practice of science. This brings us to our fourth and our last thing that Christianity in Genesis 1, this is going to be the shortest, gives to the practice of science, is the big question, why? Right? Why do we do all this? And we already kind of started to get at this in the last couple of answers and really in the last couple of talks. But what is the purpose? What's the purpose in all that we're studying, all that we're doing? It's the question of teleology, ends. Humans act for ends. Humans act for purposes. What's the big purpose when you're trying to do the sciences? And it's not really enough to just have little short-term goals, right? I want to get a conclusion to this experiment. I want to come up with a product that secures my job. I want to make money and provide a living. Those are all fine, small, short-term goals. I want to get an A in my class, survive that, get out of my house, you know. But when it comes to good science, it has to extend beyond the interests of the moment. A lot of us have this picture of this creative genius who just is fixated at a problem and cannot rest until it's solved, right? You have the Oppenheimer, chipping away at a problem in a room, seeing visions. Right? And that's not often how a lot of science works. A lot of scientists are just people working jobs, and you work the same problem for 15, 20, whatever years, and you start to give up hope. You can get burned out. You get a problem in your marriage, problem with your kids, problem with all these sorts of things can go on at the same time because you're a human person doing science. So what does Christianity give you for pursuing those goals? There's a lot we could go into, but I want to synthesize them into just two, which we've already covered, which is the love of God and the love of neighbor, right? So the unfolding of dominion, as we've already kind of hinted at, is the love of neighbor, right? Everything that you're doing, all that you're trying to pursue, every little thesis in physics, every little thesis in genetics, every little thesis in chemistry, all that should be either limited by or pursued unto the end of trying to bless and love your neighbor, the world around you, to make human life, to promote human flourishing, to reflect. You cannot build and you cannot bring about in your own strength the kingdom of God, but you can foreshadow it, foretaste it, point to it in your efforts to bring about small-scale healing. It's not resurrection, but it's pointing at it, right? Second, and this is maybe the biggest one, is simply worship and enjoyment of God himself. And this is subtle. I can't go into all the ways that Genesis 1 teaches us because we're running out of time. But one of the beautiful things that you start to look at when you look at the whole Bible and Genesis 1 in light of it is that Genesis 1 depicts not just the creation of a world, but the creation of the world as a temple and a tabernacle, right? And it depicts Adam, the image, as a priest who is, as the chief of all of creation, his main job in dominion, all those sorts of things, is actually leading all of creation in the worship of God, right? The whole world is supposed to be a temple and a tabernacle wherein humanity and the whole world meets with the God who wants to dwell among them. And the most beautiful and highest and truest goal of science itself is to look at the world that God has made, that God wants to dwell with us in, and in a sense, restructure it, reshape it, form it, and offer it back to God as an act of worship, and enjoy it as a site of worship, to see God reflected in the creation. This gets us to what the Westminster Shorter Catechism, first question and answer. The chief purpose of humanity in all that it does, at all times, in all places, is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. So that means whatever you do, whether it's writing literature, raising your children, being a bank teller, working in a lab, all the things that you're pursuing, all of these things are actually aimed at the enjoyment of God as you enjoy his world that he made and love, and worshiping him as you reflect on him and as you offer it all back to him. And honestly, it's just as a final freebie point, all this ultimately actually points to Christ, right? The enjoyment of Christ himself, Jesus Christ himself. Because here's the thing, we didn't read this text, but John 1:1 opens in a very fascinating way, if you're attuned to what we have just read. John 1:1, which I should have memorized, opens like this. Like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The word here, the word, logos, speaks in the ancient terms of basically the rationality, the reason, the ordering principle of all things. And this is what Genesis 1 is dimly pointing to, the truth that when God spoke all things into existence, he was actually speaking them into existence through his word, through the Son, through the person of Jesus. And here, at the end of the day, when you are pursuing science, when you're pursuing a knowledge of the world as it is, what you're actually doing is you're actually looking at a world that was shaped and ordered and bears the structure of the mind of God, which is the person of the Son, God himself, right? At the end of the day, science done properly is done in love and in wonder and in pursuit of a knowledge of Christ. And that goal is enough to keep you going at all times and all places, through years of success, years of hardship, years of obscurity, years of glory. Because Christ is all in any of those places. And so, to bring it, to land it again, science and Christianity are not only not in conflict, they are in beautifully deep concord as they find their center point. True science and true Christianity, as they find their center point in the Son. Bow your heads and pray with me. Lord, you are good and you do good. Do good to us today in allowing us to reflect on your reality, the truth, and the beauty of your word, revealed both in Scripture and in nature. and in science, the knowledge of God in all things. We pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you. Well, we have a 10-minute break, and then the panel Q&A session will begin at 12:32, and then lunch will be served at 1. And so we're really excited. The caterers are here. So please take a break, 10 minutes, go to the restroom as we set up for the panel. Thank you. Yes. If just so that people can see you guys, yeah.
One into the next, into the next.
It was a beautiful organic overlap.
It evolved
As
there.
evolving.
Well, we are at the final Q&A session. I know that there were probably questions that you wanted to ask during or after each of our speakers' talks, and we just kind of pushed it all the way to the end here for the panel discussion. And so we are really glad that you are here, and we're looking forward to hearing your questions. I think this is part of the excitement, as well as having these three speakers on their topics and their backgrounds and questions that you have. So just a few words of thank you to all three speakers, as well as thanking you from your various churches, Westminster OPC, other churches here in Southern California, as well as the campuses, UC Irvine, USC, the community colleges here, Cal State Long Beach, and other representatives from local churches. So we're really glad you're here. So one more thing too, if you have, some of you received free books for signing up early. If you would like, my assistant will pull up one of the books. We've got a good 15, 20 left. And so if you want a copy of that book, just raise your hand, and over the course of the time, he will come and bring them. So, great. So I'd like to begin with, I'm actually letting him give those away. Is there a question? Does somebody have a question? I'll bring the mic to you, and you can ask the panel any questions that you have. So, oh, she wants a book. Okay, then I'll just wait. I'll wait till the books are all gone. It's like, you have a book and a question. That's great. Yes, a twofer. Just introduce yourself and then ask if you want to, and then ask the question.
My name is Marie Bergman. My question is, how do you respond in our culture now that it's more not reality? I think more of for Ram Swami, pastor, the one in the middle. When it's not, it's your truth, my truth. It's all relative, and coming away from reality, and it's just what it feels like. How do you respond to that, to non-believers, in truth and in love? Or do you just not engage since we have different worldviews? What do you suggest?
Yeah, I think I get the sense of the question. Trying to talk to your neighbors who, at least when it comes to religion and certain kind of, I'm guessing, big ethical questions, a lot of the ethos, a lot of the vibe is, well, that's true for you, that works for you, this works for me, and not only does this work for me, I need you to acknowledge that this is my reality, and especially when we're coming to controverted questions around gendered identity, things like that. I think the first thing I'd say is fundamentally, people at bottom do know that there's truth. They act as if that's true in all sorts of other areas of their lives, except for the places that they don't want to, they want the subjective thing going, like your truth, my truth, in certain select areas. But when it comes to the truth of, okay, fine, give me your car. It's my car. What? No, that's my car. No, I feel like it's my car. Okay, but I have a title. It says it's mine. Maybe. Like, everybody has areas where they very clearly believe in absolute or non-relative truth. And so usually what's helpful is starting to talk to them, just talking about the areas that the fact that they concede the truth in certain areas, like you think gravity holds, you believe that 2 + 2 = 4, you believe, okay, once we've established that, moving over and saying, okay, now why are you saying that this area over here is not that same kind of truth? And a lot of it has to do with kind of patiently working through, and it really is patient, because sometimes people have been, in a sense, so trained to almost treat religious truths in the area of feelings, and our culture, our feelings are allegedly not supposed to be judged. They're just supposed to be accepted. They're supposed to be affirmed, although people still do judge them, right? If you get mad at the wrong thing online, if you're not happy about the right thing, then you will be condemned. So this is my long. I'm probably hear from the other guys what they have to say, but my long-winded way of saying a lot of it has to do with a lot of patience, a lot of just, all right, let's think through the question of truth. Let's think through the question of right and wrong. Let's think through all these areas where you don't operate the way you're operating right here, right? Where you don't, and even exploring the way in that moment they're asking you to abide by their vision of reality, their vision of truth. It's kind of hard when I don't have like a concrete example in view. So I'm trying to kind of spit on the fly. The short answer at the end of it is you do have to engage, especially if they're your neighbors and you're having these conversations. But it really often is going to have to be slow, patient entanglement, engagement. One of my favorite little chapters in a book that talks about this kind of thing is just, I think it's the 3rd chapter in Reason for God. Tim Keller's books are really good on all of this stuff, but his book on the Reason for God talks a lot about dealing with people who claim they don't believe in objective truth, but really they operate like they do all the time. That was kind of an ugly answer, but if you want to ask a clarifying example, yeah. Guys, any other input?
Yeah, I agree with Derek, and that is that it's just not true what they say. My truth, your truth. That's what is being said. But functionally, in the way that they live their own life, they don't live that way. They live as if there are absolutes in their life. So how do we practically tell them about the truth of Jesus or the truth of Christianity? And I think that what tells us is that we have to actually begin a step a little before that. I think what our culture and our generation craves is kind of an affirmation of some sort. And I struggle with that. I don't know how to do that. Ask my wife. I do not know how to be an affirming person, but I do know that it's easier for someone to receive a new truth from you if they understand and feel like you understand where they're coming from. And this is why I think the gospel message is the greatest truth, because it begins with Jesus knowing you. And if you recognize that and see that, you can receive all sorts of truth from him. As the scriptures say, in him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Not at Harvard, not at Oxford or Columbia, in Jesus.
I'll just say one quick thing. My advice also was just try to understand them, right? When you're talking to them, not every conversation has to conclude with you having the ultimate finishing word that's going to defeat all of their objections or anything like that. Many conversations are worthwhile to have just because they help you to understand their truth better, right? You understand where they're coming from. I'm the opposite sort of person. I'm way too affirming. So, of course I'd say something like that. But.
We have another question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Carissa. I had a question for Jack Van Drunen. You had touched on how being in academia and being in a scientific, science-based career, you can have a lot of differing perspectives or even conflicting perspectives with your colleagues, with maybe different beliefs based on how we believe as Christians and the Bible being our basis. You share that you have some personal experience with that. Do you have an example that you'd like to share, and just how you were able to manage that interaction and what the outcome of that was?
Yeah, I think the example I was thinking of was less of a particular example where I had a debate with someone over this stuff, but just perceiving the vibe among my secular colleagues that the Bible is not a particularly, it's just sort of, they're not even particularly anti-Bible, but they just don't really care. So, I try to work things in and work biblical principles in all the strangest ways that that really are, I don't know, I hope they're not doing more harm than good. But most recently, I was in some situation where we were deciding where to sit at the dinner table. I said, it's just like Jesus said, don't sit at the place of honor, but sit down below so that, you're not embarrassed when, and I sort of made it into a sort of very pragmatic kind of piece of advice. And one of my friends who's not a Christian says, Jack, you seem to take all the wrong lessons from what Jesus is saying. And well, if I can get a non-Christian to tell me that I'm taking the wrong lessons from what Jesus is saying, maybe that's a step in the right direction. But
Thank you. We have another question.
Hello, gentlemen. My question is kind of centered around a personal situation. I have extended family members who, in fact, almost all of my extended family members are not Christian, do not believe the Bible, would openly mock the Bible if the opportunity arose, and have told me I'm an idiot in one way or another for believing the truth of the gospel and the truth of the Bible. And very often when I try to engage in conversation with them about it, I get angry or frustrated, and it is very easy to want to stop talking about the gospel and just tell them they're going to hell, and there's nothing I can do about it. That's my flesh desiring that. My question for you is, what scripture do you call to mind, or what teaching that Christ focused on in his ministry do you call to mind when you are trying to remember the love of Christ when sharing the gospel with people that are naturally opposed to it?
Should have brought my Bible up here.
I'm not just checking my phone. I didn't have my Bible. I'm just using the app. You might have it off the top of your head.
I don't know why. Don't throw pearls to swine.
It's funny. So one of the ones that I'm not sure I call, and you can judge how quickly I call it to mind by the fact that I'm having to look it up. But one text that ought to be in mind is 1 Peter chapter 3. There's just a long section here in 1 Peter about dealing with people who are hostile to the gospel, hostile to the early church. And I'll just read sections of it here. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. For whoever desires to love life and see good days, let him keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit. Let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but being made alive in the spirit. And he goes on from there. That was a long passage, but right in the middle of it, there's that very famous apologetics verse. Be ready to give an answer for those who for the hope for which you believe. And we always kind of crop it from the rest of the context. And the rest of the context is an admonition to faithful living in the face of great hostility, reviling, evil. He says, this is Jesus stuff. Don't answer evil for evil. Don't turn the other cheek. Don't repay cursing with more cursing. Repay it with blessing. This is the basic gospel of Jesus coming to you when you were a sinner, when you thought God was to be hated and to be mocked, when you were a blasphemer, when you were an idolater, when you were a hater of God in your heart. That is precisely when Christ died for you. And so in that moment, that's just a central gospel moment of Jesus was loving people and actively saving him while they were driving 9-inch nails into his hands. It doesn't get more basic than Christ on the cross dying to save the people who were killing him. And there's a sense in which when you're entering the dialogue with your family and trying to love them, and they are, piercing you with their words. Christ did not repay evil for evil. Christ did not curse. Christ blessed. And so that's a hard call. And yet, I think just meditating Christ's words on the cross, meditating on this, the not reviling for revilement, and recognizing that you were once a reviler and are being transformed into a worshiper. Those things, I think, are important for just killing our fleshly tendency to just, I'm not the idiot, you are. And they might be. But there's, just that impulse is just, that's the Spirit working the cross in your heart in every situation. That's where I would go.
Sorry.
Can I?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Could I say a couple of things too? Because I think that this is a really great question. I don't have a good answer to it, so why am I saying stuff? It really depends, I think, for me on where I am in my Bible reading in the mornings and things like that, right? Because there are always new things that get drawn to attention and that sit in my mind as I think about going. So the question was a reminder, verses to remind us about God's love when we're witnessing to people, right? Yeah. I think most recently, as I said, I struggle with being too affirming, and I sympathize with people who don't want to become Christians because it's a big decision. It's a life-changing decision. But I'm reminded that it's also a change for the good by, maybe most recently, in 2 Corinthians 1, we read about the God of consolation. And I think, yeah, that's a lot of what I want in life involves consolation, and I'd like other people to have that as well. But I think the whole struggling with wanting to just throw up our hands and walk away, too, might be addressed by really meditating on some of the passages in Revelation that describe what the judgment of God looks like, right? Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat in the cloud, "Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Then another angel came out from the altar, and the angel who has authority over fire, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, "Use your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle over the earth, and gathered the vintage of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for a distance of about 200 miles. I don't think that these depictions of hell, if properly meditated on, leave us at all vindictive and wanting to say, oh yeah, you're going to hell, Rather, I think, boy, it's an important thing to be sharing the gospel, right? The hell is an impulse, I think, to think through just why it's so important that we persist in sharing the gospel.
Can I just offer let me offer some encouragement to you. And that is, you plead with your family, you're patient with your children, and we ought to thank God for those kinds of individuals in our life. Because without those individuals, we would not know how to plead with them like Christ pleads with us. And so as you engage in that exercise, you become like Christ. And as you become like him, you become harder and harder to ignore when the person sees the person of Jesus in you. It's really easy to ignore propositional truth. It's really hard to ignore the source of truth in the person of Jesus.
We have another question here.
My question comes from when we were reading in Genesis. I know that there's a little bit of controversy, I guess I would say, in how long each day of creation was. I mean, some people will say, 1,000 years to God is 1 year to us, so on and so forth. But when you were reading it, verse 12 kind of stuck out to me, and it's never really stuck out to me like this before. It says, the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its own kind, and God saw that it was good. So it is kind of setting it up as if the vegetation gave fruit on that day, and we obviously know that that cannot happen in a 24-hour period. So I guess my question is, does that kind of give credence to one way or the other on how long creation truly took? Should you interpret it that each day is a 24-hour period? Should you interpret it that these things took more time than that? So I don't know if that's a good question, but that's, I guess, what I got from it.
Stevenson.
Don't look at me. I was hoping, a question like this would not come up. Questions like these often come up. What you're really asking is, how do we harmonize what we have learned in the sciences and what seems to be communicated in the scriptures? And I don't have a really good answer for that except this. It is that whatever method you use, you need to be consistent in the use of your message in such a way that it is consistent with the gospel. Because we could very much say the same thing about the resurrection of Jesus. Because the sciences tell us for the last thousands of years, there has been no man that has ever resurrected. And so if we are consistent in our application, right, then you ought to question that too as a Christian. But you don't. In that scenario, you place the authority of Scripture above the authority of natural science or biology. So my question would be to you is, how are you picking and choosing when you are doing that? Right?
Yeah. So I actually have a fairly easily settled view on the days of creation. The PCA has, my denomination has a committee report. It's 100 pages on acceptable views there's a range of acceptable views that are consistent with the inerrancy of Scripture, which I affirm, and the historicity of Adam, which I affirm, and all sorts of things, and the fact that special creation occurred and all that. But So I've read that, and I affirm that that committee report is good, and there are a range of acceptable views. But I will say this, within church history, when it comes to those details, things like that, I mean, St. Augustine, one of the fathers of orthodoxy, has a very famous commentary on the literal interpretation of the days of Genesis. And he comes to the conclusion, obviously this is a narrative that's been kind of spaced out. God, in his sovereign power, obviously created everything in a singular instant as it was, because why would he need to space it out for time? He's God. So he thought it was completely consistent with the dignity and power of God, that everything be absolutely in a moment. He thought 6 days was too long. Just like, come on, 6 days? And that was his very conservative take, right? Aquinas thought differently. He thought it was 6 24-hour days, and you'll find a range in between there. Herman Bavinck, Dutch guy, one of my favorites, he said, no, these are supposed to be 7 24-hour days, but realize the genre is this is telling the story of creation on analogy with a human work week. You're supposed to see God going to work like you do. You work 6 days a week and you take a day off because God told you to. And so it's spacing God's work of creation in this genre, in a narrative that times it all out like a work week, so that you can understand what he was up to. And so he has this kind of analogous 7-day view. And again, nobody really questions his orthodoxy on these sorts of things. All that just, there's all sorts of, sorry, I'm making this complicated, but some of these details are hard to use as evidence one way or another, depending on what kind of genre you think you're dealing with. I do think it's history. I do think it's telling us that God did all these things in a space of time. But, you've got earlier problems in the narrative when it comes to, you've got light on the second day, and you got no sun until, later on in that. So is it a 24-hour spinning around the Sunday? Now, there's nothing to say that God couldn't have measured out 24-hour time periods ahead of time, knowing when how far he was going to space the sun out from the earth. It's his power, right? His absolute power. So I don't question it on the basis of the possibilities of what science tells me he could or couldn't do. I believe in an omnipotent God. It's still to me an open question as to whether or not the details of the narrative actually require a 24-hour period reading. I'm not convinced it does, but there are really, really smart people who I respect their opinion on, who have no problem with reading it that way. And so that was my vague way of saying, I don't think that detail requires it, but it could be consistent with a longer timeline view. So
thank you.
I'll stop there.
Thank you for that question. And with that, we'll close because lunch is served, and we're just very thankful and glad that you you chose to come and be with us. And so I hope you will get to know one another, and this is also an opportunity to you can ask our speakers more questions during the lunch. Just let them eat. And I just want to thank you very much for coming. Let me close this with prayer as well as for the food. Our Father, we thank you for this conference, that indeed your scriptures, your truth is relevant for every area of our lives, Lord, even in the sciences. And so, Lord, I thank you for the speakers, for the truth and their talks, and I thank you for all who came. We pray that they would be strengthened in their faith, and as well as those who maybe came with questions and doubts, and they're skeptical in some way. And I pray that you had helped them along as well. So as we go now, prepare to eat, bless our food, bless our discussions, bless our relationships. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. So if you would go right out, and the food line is just through the center doors in which you came in. Thank you very much.